In order to contain Russia, a full selection of methods is being used, from attempts at political isolation and economic pressure to a wide-scale information war and special services methods. As it has been recently directly and openly said, they are going to twist the arms of those who don't agree. But such tricks do not work with Russia, have never worked before, and will not work in the future.
Russia is responsible for the violence in eastern Ukraine. The violence is encouraged by Russia. The separatists are trained by Russia. They are armed by Russia. They are funded by Russia.
And the only way the United States can have any effect in this region and turn the tide is to start killing Russians. Killing Russians by killing so many Russians that even Putin's media can't hide the fact that Russians are returning to the motherland in body bags.
The United States is imposing new sanctions in key sectors of the Russian economy: energy, arms, and finance.
Well, the questions I'd be asking is, number one, who could have shot it down? Who had the equipment? It's obviously an anti-aircraft missile. Who could have had the expertise to do that?
Putin's ambitions are blindingly obvious, my friends. He wants to prop up Assad, play kingmaker in any transition, undermine U.S. policy and operations, and ultimately expand Russian power in the Middle East.
NATO's supreme commander says the West must do more to counter Russia by employing a rapid reaction approach to internet communications that counteracts Russia's false narratives spread on social media. Philip Breedlove said Sunday that Vladimir Putin's Russia has been waging information warfare as part of its actions against Ukraine. Breedlove said, "We need as a Western group of nations or as an alliance to engage in this informational warfare. The way to attack the false narrative is to drag the false narrative into the light and expose it."
British media, though, reporting the heir to the throne made a rather unguarded comment, it would appear, comparing Russian President Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler.
A fifth of the world's economy, almost a half of Earth's population. The BRICS nations are set to counter the Western domination, and they're banking on a new global order. Can the new BRICS bank balance the Western hold on international finance? Will the member states be able to cement their bloc with closer ties? And how will their rising strength reshape the world in years to come?
As illustrated by Time magazine in a recent report, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, otherwise known as the BRICS, don't like a US dollar-denominated world reserve currency. They've been kneecapped by it for far too long, not to mention sponsored wars and bankrupted nations around the world. So naturally they are planning a breakaway, a fresh start from the US and European-inspired money launderer and debt monster that makes up these institutions, and are planning a new one all on their own. According to insiders in Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street, this is a real game changer for the West. With the announcement of a new development bank headquartered in Shanghai to be operational in 2016, the BRICS nations are threatening the very existence and the monopoly on international finance and indentured servitude Western banks have enjoyed arguably for far too long. It thus makes perfect sense why the Obama administration, a representative not of the people but of too big to fail banks and giant multinational corporations, is actively campaigning to demonize Putin and all things Russian. Ironically, the American people have Russia and Putin to be thankful for more in recent years than they do Obama or the United States government. Putin's asylum of American patriot and truth teller Edward Snowden just one notable example. Snowden's leak of a vast illegal and anti-constitutional wiretapping and surveillance program here in the United States is arguably the biggest story and the largest example of Washington corruption and overreach this century. It highlights the anti-constitutional sewer pit that makes up Washington, D.C. today. But remember, Putin is the enemy here. Not only is the West demonizing Putin, but they are also actively campaigning for the demonization of rising China and its allies. They're communists, remember? They oppress their people. like bank bailouts, quantitative easing, Obamacare, and spying on American citizens, is anything representative of a capitalist or free society. The new development bank, set to launch in 2 years' time, will also have a twin, just like the World Bank. This twin, the equivalent of the Western-inspired International Monetary Fund, will provide short-term emergency loans to participating countries, really just long-term and perpetual debt obligations of its member states. Like the World Bank and IMF today, this will provide tremendous power to the BRICS. It will strengthen the ruble, the renminbi, and any other BRICS-backed currency or digital equivalent, and likely collapse the US dollar. But of course, this has been the point since the very beginning. Global engineering of a global currency and a new world order. Engineer bank bailouts, financial stimulus, and giant wealth transfers from the middle class, the poor, to the rich has only helped the collapse along the way. And now it's coming to fruition. A new baby is being born, and it's not the United States.
To one of our top stories now. Too much devotion to the dollar is widely regarded as one of the causes of the global financial crisis in 2008, aftershock still being felt in Europe today, of course. Their countries that they thought have found a saviour in the form of the IMF loans are now being criticised for criticising the lender for holding them captive because of it, the terms and conditions of it. According to the IMF's bailout terms, a borrowing country has got to slash jobs, pensions, wages, even change laws in accordance with the lender's whim. Spain, for example, forced around 1 million people out of work. More than half of the nation's young people are still unemployed. More stats. Portugal, still dealing with a banking crisis and shrinking GDP. Mustn't forget Greece either, after 6 years of recession. Still got the worst unemployment rate in the EU. Let's talk about the developments here then regarding BRICS, regarding the IMF. Pepe Escobar's with us live on the line. Hi, Pepe. So, talking about BRICS now forming their own bank, one of our big stories this morning. How big a rival is it going to be, really, though, to the IMF or the World Bank end of the day? Real stuff or wishful thinking?
No, look, it's a long and winding road, and it starts now. Look, the first BRICS summit was in Yekaterinburg in Russia 6 years ago. Now we have facts on the ground, on the airwaves, and all over the world. I would say this is the beginning of the implosion of the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. This is a development bank by emerging powers. It's based on the Brazilian Development Bank. Many of these beautiful stadia that you see during the World Cup, they were financed by the Brazilian Development Bank. So it's financing of infrastructure by the BRICS themselves, among themselves in 5 countries. Then they can start lending to other countries as well. They can help to industrialize Africa in the long run, and without all these conditions imposed by loans by the IMF and the World Bank.
It sounds like bad business. The IMF just announced that if Ukraine defaults on its debts to creditors, it will still loan it money. Would you loan money to a deadbeat? That's how the IMF works. It loans billions to countries who it knows can't pay back. It's a Jewish scam to foreclose on a country's assets. You see, the IMF's major shareholder is the U.S. Treasury with sole veto rights. Current and former heads of the Treasury, Jacob Lew, Larry Summers, and Robert Rubin, are all Goldman Sachs boys. Sounds like a guest list to a bar mitzvah, doesn't it? Goys, too. Paulson and Geithner, both shills for the bar mitzvah bunch at Goldman Sachs. Lagarde is just Gentile window dressing. Connect the dots. The U.S. Treasury that runs the IMF is bankrolled at interest by the Fed, a consortium of Jewish banks orbited around the Rothschild dynasty. The IMF is a Jewish bankster operation whose loans are not to boost a country's economy, but to pay off creditors it already owes, many of whom are part of the kleptocracy. Yat says so himself.
You are well aware that the government launched a 4-year EFF program with the IMF. Together with the IMF, we expect to get up to $25 billion in the forthcoming 4 years, but the gap is much bigger. As you are well aware, this money goes directly to our creditors.
And with a 1-2 punch, the IMF is screwing Ukraine. Punch 1 is to shrink the economy via austerity. This is done by IMF conditionalities. which demands raising taxes and cutting government benefits. And Yats takes the bait.
Despite the fact that the government has frozen all social expenditures, we shut down a number of entitlement programs, we did everything we can to fix the budget gap, we still need an additional enormous amount of financial support.
It's a bottomless pit. Cutting government programs and raising taxes only widens the budget deficit by reducing the purchasing power of the citizens. With no buyers, the GDP shrivels up. And with Ukraine ditching its lucrative Russian market, and with Europe spurning Ukrainian-made goods, Ukraine is now a failed state. The IMF likes it like that. Now comes punch two. With compound interest climbing and the debt unserviceable, the IMF demands that Ukraine sell off its assets to cool the creditors. Even with privatization, the debt will never be paid off, and Ukraine becomes an eternal vassal to Jewish banksters. And with Yats and U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker now planning a Ukrainian fire sale, the IMF and its client Monsanto are licking their chops over Ukraine's farmland too. Not for nothing did they install Saakashvili as the new governor of Odessa, a vital part of Ukraine's breadbasket and maritime shipping. He just admitted that things were much better under Yanukovych, who Nudelman of the U.S. State Department toppled.
А сегодня мы самая бедная страна в Европе. Мы понимаем, о чем мы говорим? Мы говорим, что реально, если обычно, даже если остановить разруху, падение, и обычно развиваться, у нас не будет перспективы, это развитие после 20 лет куда-то дойдем. Мы дойдем после 20 лет к Украине Януковича по экономическим показателям.
Ain't gonna happen. Once the IMF fleeces the assets, Yanukovych's Ukraine will be a Jewish-owned state. And that's how the IMF works. My dear Ukrainians, you can kiss your country goodbye.
We begin as President Obama becomes the first president in U.S. history to make 2 visits to India. That's where the President and First Lady have just wrapped up their 3-day visit. Obama also became the first U.S. president to be the chief guest at India's Republic Day parade, which took place on Monday. But it is what China is saying to India about that visit that's grabbing attention. The Chinese telling India to avoid a, quote, zero-sum trap being set by Washington and its allies. The Chinese seem to believe that the U.S. is singling out, even pressuring India to become a key ally in order to slow China's rise. That Republic Day parade became an opportunity for China's president to express China's willingness to, quote, make concerted efforts with India to lift their strategic cooperative partnership oriented to peace and prosperity to a higher level, end quote. So what does this back and forth over India really mean? For Insight, I was joined earlier by journalist, professor, and former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy under Ronald Reagan, Paul Craig Roberts. And I began by asking him if, in fact, the United States is working to drive a wedge between Beijing and New Delhi.
Washington is very disturbed about the formation of BRICS. They're disturbed about the recent trade deal made between Putin and India. And they certainly don't want India pulled into that Chinese-Russian alliance. So yes, this is an effort to disturb the relationships between India, China, and Russia.
It's fairly interesting. You know, President Nixon, as you know, was the first U.S. president to visit the People's Republic of China. Nixon and Kissinger did not like India at all. Now, listen, you brought this up a minute ago. We've heard very little about India until recently, but we see the U.S. kind of fighting this uphill battle because India is part of that BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. How significant is BRICS right now in terms of a threat to kind of the U.S. place on the world scene?
Well, the populations and the land mass of those areas is enormous. And certainly China has taken over the lead of economic development from all other countries. And India has had a good bit of development in professional tradable skills. And so it does have the potential of abandoning the use of the dollar, of leaving the Western financial mechanisms and clearing mechanisms. And this then is a direct threat to the exchange value of the dollar. So I think it does have the potential of forming a kind of trade relationship that undermines the ability of the United States to control all the outcomes. You know, Washington is very control-oriented, and it has a lot of control because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of the tendency of the European countries to follow Washington's lead. And so it sees the BRICS as a real challenge to Washington's ability to control outcomes. And so it will do whatever it can to break it up.
The word control that you're using there is an interesting word. I think it's a very accurate word, simply because for so many decades, the United States has kind of strong-armed a lot of these other nations, and that includes through a variety of means, including trade, including our willingness to import goods or to allow cheaper goods to be sold here, as well as when we talk about, you know, some of these issues specific to emerging nations like India and like China, this idea of controlling foreign aid that goes out. BRICS is in direct contrast to that, creating its own system of trade, as you talked about, and financial system for helping smaller developing nations so that they're not reliant on the United States. Are we watching U.S. control of a lot of these issues kind of falling through our fingers at this point?
Well, that's the potential. It's beginning to happen because Washington is picking on Russia, is picking on China. And this is a mistake because they're very large and powerful countries. And so it does show that Washington is worried that it is going to see the world develop into more than a unipolar place.
Moving on now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned against attempts by certain countries to dominate the world.
In the past decades, basic principles of international cooperation have been increasingly ignored. Principles won in pain by mankind after the hardship of war. We have seen attempts to create a unipolar world. We see a military bloc mentality expanding. All this undermines the stability of global development.
Putin made the remarks in his address commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. US President Barack Obama has boycotted the festivities, as have the leaders of Britain and France, Russia's other key allies during the Second World War. Ties between Washington and Moscow have reached an all-time low over the crisis in Ukraine. Well, to discuss this more, let's go to Leesburg and talk to Mike Billington with the Asia Desk of the Executive Intelligence Review. Welcome, sir. Mr. Billington, I think the Russian president was alluding to the United States when he denounced any attempt for a unipolar world. Do you think the era of a unipolar world has come to an end, or are there signs of its comeback?
There's no question but that the Anglo-New York axis is functioning as a unipolar world, as sort of like the gods of Olympus sitting on top of Olympus throwing their thunderbolts out, while in fact the mountain is crumbling out from under them. Besides what Mr. Putin said in Moscow today, the reality is that not only did the Russian army, all services, parade through Beautiful Square, which is called Red Square, but it's actually Beautiful Square, but also the whole Chinese military was there. And on the podium was Mr. Xi Jinping sitting next to Mr. Putin, along with Mr. Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan, pretty much next to them. This is a new world order. We are watching the BRICS nations, led largely by China and Russia and India, in a situation where they have begun to put together an entirely new world order. And the demonstration today of for the first time ever, the Chinese military marched through Beautiful Square, Red Square. This was a very clear demonstration that the attempt by Obama and his British backers, Mr. Cameron, who unfortunately apparently used vote fraud to get back in for 5 years, who are planning on continuing their policy of waging war wherever they want, whenever they want, and using Ukraine and the Middle East as excuses for provoking a war with Russia, willing to go to war with Russia precisely because they see that Russia, China, and India, through heading up new world financial systems, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS and New Development Bank, and demonstrating that they are not going to back down to the military threats, represents a threat to the collapsing Western financial system. They know it's collapsing. They know that the European and American financial system is kaput. It's going under. Mr. LaRouche today was interviewed by Sputnik News, the old RIA Novosti, congratulating Russia and the Chinese on celebrating Victory Day, and making the same point really that Putin did, which is that they are not only standing up for the defense against fascism in the 1940s, 30s, and 40s, but the reason that the Western nations boycotted Victory Day in Moscow is that they are supporting the revival of fascism in Europe, in Ukraine. That the Svoboda Party and the Azov Battalion carrying the swastikas, openly praising Stefan Bandera, the Hitler collaborator in Ukraine, represents the revival of fascism openly supported by the Obama administration through Victoria Nuland and others. And not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of Eastern and Western Europe. This is a threat to civilization. It's not just a threat to Ukraine or to Russia. It's a threat to civilization, a threat of thermonuclear war, which is not far off if we do not reverse the process immediately in the United States and in Europe and restore what was once well known as the American system. Have Europe and the United States join with the BRICS on great development projects rather than confronting them with threats of war.
And so do you think the United States will give in to this new world order, to a multipolar world order?
I think that's up to us here in the United States. The LaRouche movement is waging a fight. Mrs. LaRouche is now touring Europe, demanding that they give up this insane confrontation with Russia and with China and join with the BRICS. This is the other paradigm that exists for mankind today. And many in Europe are now recognizing this. You might know that Mrs. Merkel, even though she was arm-twisted not to go to Victory Day, is going to be there tomorrow. And Steinmeier, the foreign minister from Germany, was there for the parade and very clearly said we have to restore relations with Russia. This confrontation between NATO and Russia has no reason, no basis. It's insane, and it's leading us to war. Mr. Berlusconi, the former president of Italy, prime minister, said today that the empty seats in Moscow, the seats where the entire West, other than Mr. Tsipras from Greece, who is there, and of course the Greeks are very close to joining with the BRICS. They probably will be the first European nation to join with the BRICS. But the empty seats from the US, from Britain, from Russia, from France, and so forth, represent a failure of the West, not a boycott of Russia, but a demonstration of the collapse and the failure of the West financially, economically, strategically, and threatening a war. We have to turn that around, and that's what our policy here is in the LaRouche movement, is to turn this around, to get this lunatic out of the White House quickly, not in the next election, now, before World War III breaks out and before the collapse far greater than the 2007-2008 collapse hits. This is our responsibility. It's a responsibility to the human race. There are two paradigms in the world, and we have to make sure that America restores its historic role as a nation builder and not as a British-style imperial warlord.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time. Many thanks to Mike Billington with the Asia Desk of the Executive Intelligence Review from Leesburg. Thanks for your thoughts there, sir.
So what are the facts? Just a few months ago, the rightful president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted by Molotov cocktail-wielding terrorists wearing gas masks backed by the United States and Western interests. This would be the equivalent of Vladimir Putin arming Occupy Wall Street with grenade launchers and machine guns to overthrow the Obama administration here in the US. This new puppet government has since taken over and is not the rightful or legal government of the Ukraine, and Putin has not invaded this part of the world in any way. Simply, he's responded to an attack by the United States. This point is extremely important. Russia hasn't invaded anything. They haven't invaded the Ukraine, nor has Putin's military buildup on the border been an invasion. It's Russia that is under attack, the people of Ukraine, and those that have been ousted by a violent coup that are the real victims. We know, based on intelligence leaks provided by Estonian Foreign Minister Urmas Paet and EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, for instance, that the snipers behind the attacks in Ukraine during the recent terrorist attack were not snipers of the Yanukovych government, as the US mainstream media wants you to believe, but instead the Western-backed insurgents that have recently overthrown the Ukrainian government. Not only have they been killing innocents, but the insurgents have been shooting at both sides of the conflict.
Breaking news. A leaked phone call reveals the same snipers were shooting at both protesters and police in Kiev. RT's Marina Kossova joins us now live with more on this. Who was behind those snipers, Sam?
Absolutely. Well, all this information is in fact becoming public after a phone conversation was leaked and is now accessible to everyone who wants to listen in, and it is on YouTube. And that conversation, in fact, is between the EU Foreign Chief Catherine Ashton and also we have the Estonian Foreign Affairs Minister. And Catherine Ashton in that phone conversation is in fact asking him about his impressions of Ukraine, where he just returned from, and he said the picture is looking sad, and more importantly, and it's quite an eye-opener, this one is the fact that snipers were, as you said, Marina, were shooting both at protesters and officials, both sides really. So let's listen into what he had to say.
All the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides.
Well, that's, yeah.
So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that has medical doctor. She can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition, that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened. So that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers, it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
This is damning information, and it contradicts the Western narrative that the Ukrainian people have been supportive of a Western coup. Not only does this conflict with reports from Western media outlets like CNN, but it delegitimizes an already illegitimate puppet government. It also means that the Ukrainian people are no safer under Western control than they were under the previous administration. And what is the health of the Ukrainian people at this given moment? Not only has there been bloodshed, but civilians are being murdered at an ever-increasing rate, and the region is engaged in a violent civil war. Is this the peace and democracy Secretary of State John Kerry and others in Washington, D.C. have been talking about? And what about democracy? The people of Crimea, a largely Russian-speaking population, just voted with over a 95% popular vote in referendum to join Russia. Why doesn't the United States respect the will of the people? Reports from the Jerusalem Post indicate that the Odessa Jewish community is contemplating an emergency evacuation from the region should the violence in the western Ukrainian city get significantly worse. But once again, the mainstream media is playing the Jew card. Note the publisher, in order to paint Putin as the next Hitler and alienate him from the international community. This, of course, is bullshit, and it's a lie. Putin hasn't invaded Ukraine. The US and EU have through their proxy, the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations.
What I believe is absolutely inadmissible is the resolution of internal political issues in the former USSR republics through color revolutions, through coup d'etat, through unconstitutional removal of power.
Переворотов и неконституционным способом смещения власти действующей. Вот это абсолютно неприемлемо.
That is totally unacceptable. Our partners in the United States have supported those who ousted Yanukovych.
You believe that the United States had something to do with the ousting of Yanukovych, and he had to flee to Russia.
I know that for sure. I know those people who live in Ukraine. We have thousands of contacts with them. We know where and when, and who met with someone, and who worked with those who ousted Yanukovych, how they were supported, how much they were paid, how they were trained, where, in which countries, and who those instructors were. We know everything. And our American partners don't try to conceal that anyway. They said, yes, well, we did. We did train them. And we spent that much money. And it amounts to $5 billion. So there's no secret about it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're suggesting that this...
Nobody's even arguing against that.
You respect the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Sure, but we want other countries to respect the sovereignty of other countries, and Ukraine in particular. Respect for sovereignty means to not allow unconstitutional action and coup d'etat, the removal of legitimate power.
How will the renewal of legitimate power take place in your judgment? How will that come about? And what role will Russia play?
Россия никогда не принимает и не собирается принимать участие в действиях, направленных на...
Russia has not taken part and is not going to take part in any actions aimed at removing the legitimate government.
То результат очень тяжелый.
What I'm saying is that somebody does that. The result is very difficult to deal with. In Libya, we've seen the disintegration of the state. In Iraq, we've seen the territory's been filled with terrorists. In Syria, the situation is unfolding the same way. In Afghanistan, you very well know what the situation looks like. What happened in Ukraine? The coup d'etat led to a civil war. Many citizens of Ukraine did not have trust in Yanukovych, that's true. But they should have gone to the elections and elected a new leader, not commit the removal of power. But after the coup d'etat, somebody supported that, somebody liked it, but somebody did not. And those who did not like it were treated from the position of force.
Начали разговаривать с позиции силы. Результат – гражданская война.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement. Whether that was the specific motivation for the coup or not, I can't tell you, but there's always been this attitude that somehow we could intervene and use force in the region.
So you're in a little bit of a dilemma on that. We need to leave that kind of fuzzy on this, but we need the authorization to follow the leads, put the troops in, and play this. Look, ISIS got started through funding from our friends and allies, because as people will tell you in the region, if you want somebody who will fight to the death against Hezbollah, you don't put out a recruiting poster and say, you know, sign up for us, we're going to make a better world. You go after zealots, and you go after these religious fundamentalists. That's who fights Hezbollah.
But General, I'm hearing you on...
It's like a Frankenstein.
I'm hearing you on keeping Syria fuzzy, but I mean, they've been very clear in wanting to destroy and dismantle ISIS, so that's not fuzzy to me at all. The question would be, if they wipe out ISIS in Syria, which is the goal, then what with Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah.
There has to be a plan for that phase.
Well, some things you can't exactly plan that clearly because you're dealing in the realm of politics. So part of it is, can you get the Russians to withdraw their support from Bashar al-Assad? How would you do that? Well, you're dealing with the Russians in Ukraine right now, and they're not being helpful.
No, they're
in fact, from Putin's perspective, he probably sees it as the opposite play. He says that because the Americans need us to help on Iran, because they don't have a ground force in Syria, they're actually relying on us. Therefore, we can push Ukraine further, and the Americans won't stop us because they're afraid they'll lose our cooperation elsewhere in the world.
ISIS, created by the U.S. and her allies, according to General Wesley Clark. I mean, this is amazing. This is a very well-respected general. He was the commander and head of all NATO forces, not just American, but NATO forces, saying that ISIS was created by her allies. You know, countries like Saudi Arabia that are in cahoots with the United States right now, not just to put pressure on U.S. fracking corporations, but to drive oil prices to zero, to put pressure on Vladimir Putin and Russia, and to bring Iran to the nuclear dealing table so that we can negotiate with them. Those same allies, those same people responsible for creating these groups to fight, allegedly, Hezbollah, to fight the other radical elements. You see, the United States does this time and time again. It's how we throw countries. It's how we overthrow places like Egypt. It's like how we murder people like leader Muammar Gaddafi in Libya.
Who gave coalition forces in Libya the right to eliminate Gaddafi? Well, that's the question Vladimir Putin's been asking during an official visit to Denmark. The Russian premier also said NATO has effectively joined one of the warring sides in the conflict, and more responsible action should be taken instead. RT's Daniel Bushell joins us now live for this in Brussels. Daniel, so the Russian prime minister has effectively lashed out on the operation there in Libya.
Yes, he's made the speech in Denmark and he was very angry. He says that Gaddafi is not the best person in the world. Sure, he's made many mistakes, done many bad things, but that does not give the coalition the right to bomb indiscriminately. His words were that they are bombing Gaddafi's palaces in Tripoli every night. Now, a coalition said that their plan was not to get rid of Gaddafi. So his question was, Mr. Putin's question was, why are the coalition forces obviously making this effort to go after Colonel Gaddafi himself? Now, we also heard that the experts here in Brussels have confirmed that there is bombing going on by the coalition forces, which is not being covered by the media here in the European Union. Mr. Putin added that oil was a key interest for the Western powers, for the European powers who have gone into Libya, that they want to get rid of Gaddafi and install people who are more favourable to the European Union so that European companies can control the oil reserves. Let's have a listen to exactly what Mr. Putin had to say.
The coalition said destroying Gaddafi was not their goal. Then why bomb his palaces? Now some officials have claimed that eliminating him was in fact their goal. Who gave them that right? Did he have a fair trial? Returning to the no-fly zone, the bombings are destroying the country's entire infrastructure. When the so-called civilized world uses all its military power against a small country destroying what's been created by generations, I don't know if that's good.
Mr. Putin said that they have to give the Libyan people time to sort out their own problems, and there's really double standards here, he added. There are several other parts of the region in the Middle East and North Africa which is facing pretty much civil war situations, but which the West is either ignoring or not really paying the same amount of attention to.
Well, Daniel, there have been reports about an EU plan to send army convoys to assist humanitarian aid there in Libya. Of course, there'll be those who say, well, this is really the start of a military ground operation, something, of course, that allies were adamant wouldn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard these rumours for the first time a few weeks ago that the EU plans to send up to 1,000 troops under the guise of so-called humanitarian aid. Russia fears that this will be used to plan an invasion and to carry out an invasion of Libya on the pretext of supporting humanitarian aid to the Libyan people. The draft plan is called U4 Libya. It's supported by the 27 member states of the European Union, prepared by them, and it provides for ground troops, in fact, to be deployed by the Western coalition. In the port city of Misrata, which is currently under siege by forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi. Here in Brussels, Michael Mann, the chief spokesman to the European Union High Representative Catherine Ashton, said that they would only send up to 1,000 troops, and the troops would only be used if they came under attack. Otherwise, they would only defend aid. Now, Russia has said that it will only support another UN resolution if it explicitly says that it will not continue the violence, that if it ends the violence and starts negotiations, then that is the only condition under which they would support that. Now, I've been speaking to military analysts here in Brussels, and they confirm that ground troops are already in operation in Libya. This is not being covered by the media in the European Union, but troops are already in operation, and they are pushing forward in Libya with Colonel Gaddafi as the target.
Daniel, thanks very much indeed for that. That's Daniel Bushell live there in Brussels.
Well, more speculation has been raised on the reasons for NATO's intervention in Libya. And as RT's Laura Emmett reports, the organisation may have been trying to prevent Gaddafi from burying the American buck.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
We must not tolerate this regime using military force against its own people.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You'd think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli.
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this. One in '96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organised by Gaddafi. And everybody was interested. I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro.
The UK's gold is kept here in a secure vault somewhere in the depths of the Bank of England. As in most developed countries, there's not enough to go around. But that's not the case in places like Libya and many of the Gulf states. A gold dinar would have given oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries the power to turn around to their energy-hungry customers and say, sorry, the price has gone up and we want gold. Some say the US and its NATO allies literally couldn't afford to let that happen. Laura Emmett, RT, London.
Last week, when I ordered our armed forces to protect the Libyan people from the brutality of Muammar Gaddafi, I pledged to keep the American people fully informed. Since then, I've spoken about the limited scope and specific purpose of this mission. Today, I can report that thanks to the brave men and women in uniform, we've made important progress. As Commander-in-Chief, I face no greater decision than sending our military men and women into harm's way. And the United States should not and cannot intervene every time there's a crisis somewhere in the world. But I firmly believe that when innocent people are being brutalized, when someone like Gaddafi threatens a bloodbath that could destabilize an entire region, and when the international community is prepared to come together to save many thousands of lives, then it's in our national interest to act. And it's our responsibility. This is one of those times. Our military mission in Libya is clear and focused. Along with our allies and partners, we're enforcing the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. We're protecting the Libyan people from Gaddafi's forces. And we've put in place a no-fly zone and other measures to prevent further atrocities. We're succeeding in our mission. We've taken out Libya's air defenses. Gaddafi's forces are no longer advancing across Libya. In places like Benghazi, a city of some 700,000 that Gaddafi threatened to show no mercy, his forces have been pushed back. So make no mistake, because we acted quickly, a humanitarian catastrophe has been avoided and the lives of countless civilians, innocent men, women, and children have been saved.
It's been described as the final chapter for Gaddafi, but whilst the end to the war in Libya seems so near, the realisation now setting in that there still remains a long, tough battle ahead. We're joined now by Yvonne De Vito, who's just come back from Libya, where you were compiling an independent dossier on what was happening on the ground there. So thank you very much for joining us. Now, you've been saying that it's because, certainly here in Italy, the news reports about what was happening in Libya were very confusing, a lot of conflicting information. So can you tell us what you saw and what you found whilst you were there?
We went to Libya on the 28th of July and we came back on the 7th of August. And we found a totally different situation because NATO was bombarding civilians. The bombings were not only carried out on military targets, but they also hit houses, hospitals, schools, television centres. And this was totally against the humanitarian reasons they said they were there for. I believe they were doing this to bring panic in the city. That's why they were bombing the things that people use daily, like places with food and essential utilities like hospitals. This was also a difficult period for Muslims because of Ramadan, and that is why in the daytime they're in their houses. We went to Tripoli and to Zitan, and we saw huge protests with thousands of pro-Gaddafi supporters turning out against NATO, and all these demonstrations were not shown in Italy. We also visited Tangier and Samsua and found a lot of women that were screaming at us, asking why you Italians are bombing us. What did we do to you? Why are you killing our children? That was the main question. We went to Zitan the same day they bombed a house, and in this house 2 children were killed. We tried to show the pictures of these children that were dead, but apart from us, no one else did the same. Except the things that we saw with our own eyes visiting these places that were bombed. We have so much material that press officers and journalists from Libya gave to us as testimony to all the dead from the NATO bombings.
We've frozen tens of billions of dollars of Gaddafi's assets that can help meet the needs and aspirations of the Libyan people. And every day, the pressure on Gaddafi and his regime is increasing. Our message is clear and unwavering. Gaddafi's attacks against civilians must stop. his forces must pull back. Humanitarian assistance must be allowed to reach those in need. Those responsible for violence must be held accountable. Muammar Gaddafi has lost the confidence of his people and the legitimacy to rule, and the aspirations of the Libyan people must be realized.
After all the things that we saw, we have one question. Is this a humanitarian war? Are they really helping the civilians? Because I believe that all this is because of economic reasons, or at least there are other reasons why this war happened. Petroleum or other things.
Western powers have frozen the assets of Muammar Gaddafi and other senior figures in the Libyan government. They say the aim is to help bring down the government refusing the will of its people. But as RT's Lauren Lister reports, history suggests Libya may never see its money again after the international wealth grab.
As violence continues in Libya, the U.S. sends warships and more troops in that direction, fueling speculation of a military intervention. Meanwhile, Western countries may have already launched a war against Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi's North African regime.
Most countries consider the freezing of their assets as an act of economic warfare.
The weapons here, the foreign assets of either Libya, the country, or Gaddafi and his family, that some estimate to be almost $100 billion. It's believed to be spread across the globe, oil money invested through the country's sovereign wealth fund. Everything from a stake in the company that owns the Financial Times newspaper to land near the Spanish resort town of Marbella, being developed into homes and a golf course, to the oil company Viranex, and billions of dollars of cash in banks throughout Europe and the U.S. The question now is what happens to all this money, especially the $30 billion the United States has frozen, the most ever in the history of this country in this type of situation. It essentially cuts Libya off from the entire U.S. banking system. For now, it stays put while the situation is still uncertain. But what is certain, the President of the United States is now in control of this money, which gives him a powerful tool.
Look, maybe we'll make a deal about this money or some of this money, but it means you have to do the following, and whatever the U.S. At that point is trying to accomplish, presumably that he leaves.
It's all about control and profit and domination. This is the center of an empire, and it's an empire where the greatest profits come from the military contracts and the oil contracts. So they will work overtime to aid those corporations and their interests.
To enact these sanctions, the U.S. president declared the situation in Libya, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. That's not typical considering there's not a clear aggressive action Libya has taken against the U.S. As for Libya's financial interests, analysts say you could look to the history of countries such as Iran. Their assets were frozen in the wake of the 1979 hostage crisis.
Their money that was seized from Iran back in 1979 has still, not been returned to the Iranians. So it's basically time for a plunder play. If we can take it away from them, we will.
The money is used most often to pay for the settlements of lawsuits against a leader or a government, or to recoup losses. Gaddafi can likely kiss the money goodbye.
We took their nuclear capacity away, made promises, didn't live up to them, claimed that was a great victory for peace. And now we're in a situation where it's clear that oil is at stake.
The future of the massive sums of money reaped from Libyan oil is now as uncertain as the divided country it came from. Lauren Lister, RT, New York.
Now, international bankers have reportedly wasted billions of dollars invested by Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi. The Financial Times says giants like Goldman Sachs were dealing with the dictator's investments when it needed to plug a hole during the crisis. Most of the money has been lost, but with what's going on in Libya, any repayment seems unlikely. RT's Daniel Bushell has more from Berlin.
It's emerged that Western banks have been happy to invest and work with Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi and picking up huge sums in the process. As you say, France's Société Générale was advising it to make $1 billion bet on its own shares. It told Gaddafi to make $1 billion bet on its own shares, which then lost practically all their value by last year. SocGen pocketed huge sums, huge fees in the process. American lender Goldman Sachs made a $1 billion investment for Libya, which then lost over 98% of its value. And many other Western lenders have made disastrous investments for Libya's National Investment Fund. Now, the interesting thing is that these banks are claiming they won't have to pay any of that money back because the West's current war with Libya means that Gaddafi is an illegitimate ruler.
This is how the international community should work. More nations, not just the United States, bearing the responsibility and cost of upholding peace and security. This military effort is part of our larger strategy to support the Libyan people and hold the Gaddafi regime accountable.
Okay, now you've personally met Gaddafi yourself on a number of occasions. What do you think post-war and post-Gaddafi Libya is going to look like?
Even if all television stations are showing people fighting and demonstrating against Gaddafi, I personally saw many people demonstrating for Gaddafi. I don't know why so many journalists are not showing this, because they are manipulating the situation. Independent media show these videos on the internet because there is more freedom. From what we saw personally when we were in Libya, and from the documents we got, we saw the rebels as disorganized groups.
Are there fears amongst the people that the rebels coming to power will prove an ongoing continuation of the volatile situation there?
I believe that the rebels will not be able to do a good job after Gaddafi. Amongst them, there are many extremist groups, Islamists, Tunisian people. I don't know why they are there. Al-Qaeda, rebels from Libya that just wanted a change. But there is too much disorganization to make a good job. The people we interviewed were very afraid to imagine that the rebels could take power because they think that they are not able to govern the country or to take control in a proper way. The chiefs of these groups of rebels are ex-politicians, former politicians that before were with Gaddafi, and then they completely changed their face. They went with the wind, as they say in Italy.
In recent days, we've heard the voices of Libyans expressing their gratitude for this mission. "You saved our lives," said one Libyan. Said another, "Today there is hope."
الكلاب صاروا يضربوا حرام عليهم بلادنا يضربوا فيها يدمروا في بلادهم ويضربوا فيها معمر بوم على تضربوا فيه يضربوا فيه الله هو معمر هو ليبيا وبس الكلاب اصبحوا قناة جردان جندرنا لهم هم يضربوا ويقصوا جندرنا لهم الكلاب الله معمر ليبيا وبس.
When we talk of the NATO mission for humanitarian reasons, do you think that justification for the war in Libya stands up to scrutiny now?
I believe it's not a valid justification, because most of the targets were civilian ones, and many people say the people were targets on purpose, to create panic on the ground.
How much of a discrepancy did you see on the ground between what NATO was saying and what you were seeing?
Many discrepancies every day. The first day that NATO bombed a civilian target, I apologized to people, saying it was a mistake. But the day after, they kept bombing civilian targets. And when the Libyan government was asking why are you bombing civilians, NATO were denying it, saying it was Gaddafi propaganda. That wasn't true. We saw it. This is the first time that a country was attacked, even though they asked for a commission to go into the country and to investigate and find facts. That didn't happen. They just attacked. This was started with false pictures sent by Al Jazeera through the media. Other media took these pictures and confirmed them as true, and the war was on. The most important thing is that the government said it was open to negotiations, but NATO didn't want that.
Later, at a town hall-style gathering, the secretary spoke of former dictator Muammar Gaddafi, still a fugitive, in decidedly non-diplomatic terms. "We hope he can be captured or killed soon," she said, to prevent him from disrupting the new Libya.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
But the people at the top of this so-called Islamic revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood leaders and Al-Qaeda, they're all hardcore socialists, and they're international socialists. They're working also for the New World Order. So everything you see is an illusion, and that's why you have this president over there pouring money into the Muslim Brotherhood, secretly giving missiles, surface-to-air missiles, to the Al-Qaeda group, like in Mogadishu or Benghazi. This is what was the whole attack there was about. Benghazi was the Navy SEALs and the CIA were trying to find out where all of these missiles that came from the United States, who they were going to, and they had discovered it, and so they had to destroy all of the records. So they had this raid, burned all the records, killed the ambassador, killed the Navy SEALs, and destroyed all the records in the CIA office. In fact, it came out during an investigation. Well, why was the CIA next door to the ambassador's office? What is this about? And why were Navy SEALs assigned to it? But then when it came time to defend that CIA office and this intelligence, Obama and Hillary Clinton ordered them not to defend them, so they were slaughtered. Interestingly, Gaddafi, almost 10 years before, had warned the reporter Arnold de Bourges-Gravé and told him that, in fact, Benghazi was the headquarters of Al-Qaeda, and he needed help from the United States to stop them. He was terrified of them. So for 10 years he was trying to get the United States. He wanted to work with the CIA. What he didn't know was that he was being set up to be assassinated. And what happened is he decided he was going to separate from the World Bank. He was going to create his own currency. He was going to back it with gold, and he told the World Bank and the international bankers he wanted nothing to do with them. He wanted them out of his country. And, of course, very quickly they killed him. So he knew too much, and he was separating from the World Bank, which is not allowed in the international banking cartel. So that's not allowed, and you'll be overthrown. That's what happened to Gaddafi, and that's what's happening in Syria, and that's what's happening in Egypt.
Three major changes in the American monetary system have occurred in the last 100 years. The first change was the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. The second change was going off the personal gold standard in 1933. The third change was going off the national gold standard in 71 and onto the petrodollar, an extortion racket concocted by Kissinger, forcing Saudi Arabia to sell oil for dollars. We'd give the oil-producing countries military protection if they obeyed, but kill them if they didn't. Does Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi ring a bell? The goal of the petrodollar was to keep the dollar as the world reserve currency. The power that has the reserve currency gets to print money in exchange for real goods. That's why our stores are filled with cheap goods, even though we don't produce anything in exchange. And that's why prices would shoot up if the petrodollar was replaced. We're now at a point where the monetary system is going to change again. But this time, the Jews aren't in control. The game changer was launched last month by the BRICS. By creating a rival to the IMF and World Bank, Jewish apparatuses of global financial and political control. The new game in town is the BRICS New Development Bank, and it will change the way the world works. Putin told reporters, quote, The international monetary system depends on the U.S. dollar. To be precise, on the monetary policy of U.S. authorities. BRICS wants to change this, unquote. These are fighting words. For the yuan, the rupee, and the ruble will start replacing the dollar as the world reserve currency. Countries won't need dollars to buy oil anymore. And developing countries like Ukraine won't need to borrow money from the Fed and the IMF. They can borrow it from the new development bank, and at much better terms. The IMF is a death trap. It only lends for speculation, takeovers, and control. But the BRICS, to develop infrastructure and cooperation between nations, that's their stated goal. How does this affect the average American? This transition from one currency, the dollar, to multiple currencies will turn Walmart into a Neiman Marcus. Prices will soar. And what remains of American productivity, especially agricultural, will export goods chasing the stable currencies. This will cause fewer goods produced here available to Americans, and scarcity will skyrocket. And do you think sanctions against Russia are really because of Russian aggression? Not a chance. The sanctions are a desperate response to the threat posed by the new development bank to the dollar reserve currency. No sooner was the bank announced, the stooge regime in Kiev shot down the plane. The demonizing of Putin went into high gear, and sanctions were ramped up.
Explain how these sanctions, particularly the American sanctions, that are really sanctions that do not allow these companies, Russian companies, to in some way participate in the American financial system. Why do you think they're so effective?
Well, they're very effective because the dollar is the dominant currency in which all international trade occurs. And when we impose a sanction on a company, that means that they cannot have access to U.S. financial institutions, to U.S. businesses, or really to trade in the dollar.
Yet businesses in America and Germany oppose the sanctions. If the New World Order is just a corporatocracy, then the businessmen would have prevailed. But the quick marshaling of American and European sanctions, even though against their business interests, shows the existence of a supranational global governance that supersedes corporatocracy. And it shows that the character of that global governance is more political than it is commercial. It's about who controls the world. Who do we know that fits this description and can enforce a sudden global reversal of policy? The international Jewish money power, that's who. And Jacob Lew and David Cohen of the U.S. Treasury act in behalf of that power. Washington is not stupid, as Paul Craig Roberts says. It's sinister. It's a tool of international Jewry whose current monetary system is fated to hit the skids. The BRICS New Development Bank has fired the first shot.
Вам спасибо большое за вопрос по поводу наших учений, маневров, развития вооруженных сил. И вы сказали, что Россия в известной степени внесла свой вклад в ту напряженность, которую мы сейчас наблюдаем в мире. Россия внесла свой вклад, но только в том смысле, что она все жестче и жестче защищает свои национальные интересы. Мы не атакуем, в политическом смысле этого слова, мы ни на кого не нападаем. Мы только защищаем свои интересы. И недовольство наших западных партнеров, прежде всего американских, связано с тем, что мы делаем именно это, а не с тем, что мы в сфере безопасности допускаем какие-то действия, которые провоцируют напряженность. И я поясню. Вот вы говорите о полетах нашей авиации, в том числе о полетах стратегической авиации. Знаете ли вы, что Россия в начале 90-х годов полностью прекратила, как это делал Советский Союз, полеты нашей стратегической авиации в отдаленных районах патрулирования? Мы полностью прекратили. А американские самолеты стратегические с ядерным оружием продолжали летать. Зачем? Против кого? Кому угрожали? И мы не летали и не летали, не летали и не летали, из года в год. И вот только пару лет, тройку назад возобновили эти полеты. Так кто провоцирует? Мы, что ли? Значит, у нас две базы практически только за границей. И то на террористически опасных направлениях. В Киргизии, после того, как туда зашли боевики из Афганистана, по просьбе киргизских властей, тогда Акаева президента. И в Таджикистане, тоже на границе с Афганистаном. Думаю, что и вы заинтересованы в том, чтобы там было все спокойно. И это обосновано, понятно и ясно. Американские базы по всему земному шару. И вы хотите сказать, что мы ведем себя агрессивно? Ну, здравый смысл-то есть или нет? В Европе что делают американские вооруженные силы, в том числе тактическое ядерное оружие? Чего там делают? Слушайте, у нас бюджет Министерства обороны на следующий год, он вырос. Но он в долларовом эквиваленте где-то, ну, чтобы мне не ошибиться, 50 миллиардов примерно. А бюджет Пентагона почти в 10 раз больше. 575 миллиардов, по-моему, утвердил Конгресс недавно. И вы хотите сказать, что мы проводим агрессивную политику? Ну, здравый смысл-то есть или нет? Мы, что ли, свои вооруженные силы выдвигаем к границам Соединенных Штатов либо других государств? Базы кто двигает к нам НАТО? Военную инфраструктуру? Не мы. Нас кто-нибудь слушает? Хоть какой-то диалог с нами по этому поводу ведут? Нет, вообще никакого. Всегда в ответ только одно. Не ваше дело. Каждая страна имеет право выбирать свой способ обеспечения безопасности. Да, хорошо. Но тогда и мы тоже будем это делать. Почему нам это запрещено? Ну и, наконец, я уже говорил об этом и в послании, систему противоракетной обороны. Кто вышел в одностороннем порядке из договора, который, безусловно, являлся одним из краеугольных камней всей системы международной безопасности? Мы, что ли? Нет. Это сделали Штаты. В одностороннем порядке вышли. Создают угрозы для нас. Разворачивают эти элементы стратегической ПРО не только на Аляске, но и в Европе, и в Румынии, и в Польше, прямо возле нас. И вы хотите сказать, что мы проводим агрессивную политику? Вопрос, хотим ли мы равноправных отношений? Да, хотим. Но при безусловном уважении наших национальных интересов. И в сфере безопасности, и в сфере экономики. Мы 19 или сколько там лет вели переговоры по присоединению к ВТО. Пошли на очень многие компромиссы. И всегда исходили из того, что эти договоренности являются железобетонными. Потом, сейчас не буду говорить, кто прав, кто виноват. Я считаю, что мы правы в ходе украинского кризиса. Я уже об этом говорил много раз. И считаю, что наши партнеры Запада не правы. Но сейчас оставим это. Но мы присоединились к ВТО. Там есть правила. В нарушение всех этих правил и в нарушение норм международного права и Устава Организации Объединенных Наций в отношении российской экономики введены санкции. В одностороннем порядке, абсолютно неправовым способом. Мы не правы опять. Мы хотим развивать нормальные отношения и в сфере безопасности, в борьбе с терроризмом. Мы будем работать вместе по нераспространению ядерного оружия. Мы будем вместе работать над такими угрозами, как распространение наркотиков, организованной преступности, распространение инфекционных заболеваний тяжелых, в том числе Эболы. Мы будем это все вместе делать. В том числе будем работать и в экономической сфере, если этого хотят наши партнеры.
Today, and building on the measures we announced 2 weeks ago, the United States is imposing new sanctions in key sectors of the Russian economy. energy, arms, and finance. We're blocking the exports of specific goods and technologies to the Russian energy sector. We're expanding our sanctions to more Russian banks and defense companies. And we're formally suspending credit that encourages exports to Russia and financing for economic development projects in Russia. At the same time, the European Union is joining us in imposing major sanctions on Russia.
Europe's new sanctions against Russia over its alleged role in the Ukraine crisis have come into force. That's despite a week-old ceasefire deal which appears fragile but is largely holding. The measures affect ordinary Russians. Imposing sanctions on other countries is very good, he said. We need to develop industries of our own here. Alisa said, what really worries me is not the measures imposed from Europe, but the ones that were announced in return from our side because they affect individual people.
Its most significant and wide-ranging sanctions to date. In the financial sector, the EU is cutting off certain financing to state-owned banks in Russia. In the energy sector, the EU will stop exporting specific goods and technologies to Russia, which will make it more difficult for Russia to develop its oil resources over the long term. In the defense sector, the EU is prohibiting new arms imports and exports and is halting the export of sensitive technology to Russia's military users. And because we're closely coordinating our actions with Europe, the sanctions we're announcing today will have an even bigger bite. Now, Russia's actions in Ukraine and the sanctions that we've already imposed have made a weak Russian economy even weaker. Foreign investors already are increasingly staying away. Even before our actions today, nearly $100 billion in capital was expected to flee Russia. Russia's energy, financial, and defense sectors are feeling the pain. Projections for Russian economic growth are down to near zero. The major sanctions we're announcing today will continue to ratchet up the pressure on Russia, including the cronies and companies that are supporting Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine. In other words, today, Russia is once again isolating itself from the international community, setting back decades of genuine progress. And it doesn't have to come to this. It didn't have to come to this. It does not have to be this way. This is a choice that Russia, and President Putin in particular, has made.
The new sanctions target 5 state banks and curb EU business deals with energy and defense firms. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the new sanctions look strange given his support for peace efforts in embattled eastern Ukraine. Using these mechanisms seems somewhat strange, even against the whole strange background, he said. I don't even understand what these new sanctions are related to. Maybe somebody doesn't like that we've started to follow a peace process. Russia's foreign ministry said it would hit back quickly against what it described as another hostile step. Many in the EU are anxious about that revenge from Russia, the bloc's biggest energy supplier.
Что же такое однополярный мир? Как бы ни украшали этот термин, он в конечном итоге означает на практике только одно. Это один центр власти, один центр силы, один центр принятия решения. Это мир одного хозяина, одного суверена. Это, по сути, чуть ли не вся система права одного государства. Прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов. Перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится?
This is Syrian Girl. I want to talk to you about why the New World Order hates Syria and why they are attacking the country now. The New World Order is the plan to bring all nations under the control of one power. People might argue about who the real power is behind this agenda, but those who are observant will notice that this New World Order, or NWO, is the end game. Syria has always resisted and is the front lines against the New World Order. One of the ways that Syria resists is that Syria does not have a Rothschild central bank. A Rothschild central bank is a bank that has been bought by the Rothschild family, one of the richest and most powerful families in the world. It is a bank which is under the control of the Bank of International Settlements, which decides how much money is worth in a nation and how much debt a nation has. In Libya, one of the first things that happened after NATO took over that country is their central bank was turned into a Rothschild central bank. Another way in which Syria resists the New World Order is that it has no loan to the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Syria, before the crisis began, was a totally debt-free country. If it has ever taken out loans, it was not to the IMF, but to a trusted ally like Russia. The first thing that Egypt's new President Morsi did when he came to power was saddle Egypt with $4 billion worth of IMF debt. Even though he claims to be a Muslim and Islam is against debt and interest. Because Syria owes no money to world powers and her bank is free from foreign control, she is able to choose her own foreign policy. This is why Syria can oppose imperialism like in Palestine, Libya and Iraq, and ban genetically modified food. Syria has never had genetically modified food and has recently formalized this into law. Companies like Monsanto are among the war profiteers, or dogs of war. When Iraq was invaded, one of the first things that US's Bremer changed in the Iraqi constitution was to make it illegal for farmers to store their own seeds and force them to buy genetically modified seed from Monsanto. Genetically modified seeds are very expensive and carry a promise of being better than natural seeds. Many Indian farmers who bought the seeds and had their crops fail that year committed suicide because they had no money to buy new seeds from Monsanto and couldn't have saved their own seeds because they had entered a contractual agreement to purchase seeds from Monsanto. Famine reigned as a result. Controlling food supply is yet another constraint the New World Order uses to keep countries in check and bring them under the control of the one world government. Syria resists these steps to control her. Syrian state media doesn't shy away from discussions of secret societies. In Syria, talk of secret societies is not seen as a fringe conspiracy, but mainstream. Those that tell you it is not significant that two US presidential candidates, Bush and Kerry, were both members of the same tiny secret society, the Skull and Bones, are willingly blind. Oil and energy flow is yet another way in which the world powers bring nations to their knees, and yet another reason why Syria is a target. Syria recently discovered gas off its coast, and she was working on a new pipeline going through Iran, Iraq and Syria to Europe that would rival the BTC pipeline currently going through Israel. Forcing oil to pass through Israel through the BTC pipeline is the way in which the New World Order uses Israel as their hub of control of the oil flow between Europe, Asia and Africa. They can turn off the tap whenever they want, and that brings nations under their umbrella. Syria's attempt to give the world an alternative route for oil and gas could have been a way to free the world and put a wrench in the plans of the global dominators.
And I have spoken about this at length, but Syria is one of the last countries left that does not recognize the apartheid state of Israel and resists the Zionist agenda, which is a large part of the New World Order. This is one of the main reasons the New World Order sees Syria as an obstacle to its plans, and this point requires an individual video.
Another reason why the New World Order hates Syria is that it is a secular country in the Middle East. Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, and much of North Africa were secular nations. But after the Iraq War, Iraq was given a more theocratic Shiite government. After the Arab Spring and the NATO bombardment of Libya, it was given a Wahhabi extremist government. And recently, Egypt became a Muslim Brotherhood nation, another theocracy. And with Israel being the extremist Jewish theocracy in this region, Syria is really the last secular country left in the Middle East. In Syria, asking someone what their religion is insulting. And if an outsider asks you what it is, you can't help but feel a little bit defensive. And the common answer is, I am Syrian. All the prime religions have lived there in peace for hundreds of years, and with freedom to practice. Divide and conquer is a strategy which the world powers use to control nations, and Syria's unity has been a way to resist that. Syria has a very strong national and cultural identity. If you have ever traveled the world, you will notice that you can find the same shops and the same culture being spread everywhere. You can find the same clothing item in a shop in Dubai that you can find in a shop in France. This is not the case for Syria. Syria holds on to its uniqueness and its own production. Coca-Cola and other foreign companies used to be banned in Syria, but years ago the current president unbanned them, which I believe was a huge mistake. Syria had its own cola production companies that were even more delicious, that had to close down as a result of Coca-Cola being unbanned. But these reforms really only went so far to open up Syria's economy, and Syria still resisted entry of foreign companies. And I think this is one of the other reasons that Syria is hated by the New World Order. Syria is one of the last countries that remain distinct from everywhere else, and I believe there's a clear New World Order agenda to make everywhere look pretty much the same, and thereby create no more nations and one world government. What a boring world that would be. The New World Order hates Syria because Syria is free. So Orwellian it is that they shout "Free Syria" when they really try to enslave her. If Syria falls, it could be a tipping point that ends up in victory for the New World Order, like Stalingrad was a tipping point between Germany and Russia in World War II. Syria resists in spite of all the massive power of the nations against her. She resists not just for herself, but for every free person. As I said earlier, Syria is the front lines against the New World Order. So fight alongside us until the end.
I guess my question is, how many times do we have to prove that these people are blowing up people now, never mind if they get a nuclear weapon? When do we send them an airmail message to Tehran?
That old Beach Boys song, Bomb Iran? Bomb, 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 bomb. Anyway,
In May of earlier this year, Senator John McCain, Republican of Arizona, went on a secret trip to Syria to meet with rebel leaders of the Free Syrian Army, fighting in opposition to Bashar al-Assad's Syrian government. Once McCain returned home, photos surfaced of his trip claiming that he had met with known terrorists, members of the rebel group Northern Storm Brigade. Some say an adjunct of the Free Syrian Army itself and responsible for kidnapping 11 Lebanese Shiite pilgrims in Syria. Lebanon's Al Jadid TV station, which is viewed as sympathetic to Hezbollah, a Shiite militant group fighting for Assad in Syria, broke the original story. 9 of the 11 Shia kidnapped are still being held, but one of the released captives identified Mohammed Noor, chief spokesman and photographer, and Ammar al-Dadiki as part of the Northern Storm's leadership, and again as the 2 men standing beside John McCain in this picture. The story made headlines in the United States, and tough questions awaited.
Senator McCain, you were recently in Syria, and as a result of that trip, there were several reports that claimed that you had a photograph taken with a notorious kidnapper named Mohammed Noor. Your spokesman says if that was the case, it was regrettable, but Senator Rand Paul picked up on that and essentially said, if you don't know who you're having your photo taken with, how do you know who you're giving weapons to?
Well, I know who I met with, and in fact, I met with a group of Syrians yesterday.
Obviously, the question wasn't answered. So on Friday of last week, September 6th, Christopher Green and I went to Prescott, Arizona for a town hall event and followed up with the senator from Arizona.
I've been in Syria. Have you been in Syria? No.
I have not.
No, you have not. I have.
It's also clear that the American people overwhelmingly do not support a war in Syria. A research poll said 91% of Americans do not support it.
Your statement was false, so I don't have any response to a false statement.
Senator McCain, what do you say about your judgment on how to pick the good and evil in Syria when you yourself were photographed? How do we trust your judgment, picking the good and the evil in Syria?
Photograph with someone because it appeared in an Al-Qaeda newspaper in Lebanon?
You obviously know what I'm talking about. How are we supposed to trust your judgment if you're photographed with known terrorists?
I have never had anything to do with known terrorists, and I'm offended by your question.
Senator, some people believe that
the allegation came from an Al-Qaeda newspaper in Lebanon. While Al Jadid TV might be known as sympathetic, the story was also contributed to by the Daily Star, a Lebanese newspaper who was from 2000 to 2009 a representative of the New York Times in the Gulf region, hardly an Al-Qaeda affiliate. But more importantly, Al-Qaeda was founded by one-time CIA asset Osama bin Laden, a Sunni Muslim of Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda is a radical Sunni Muslim movement and still heavily funded and trained by the Sunni Gulf states and Saudi Arabia to this day. McCain obviously confuses the two. Now, whether it was intentional, using Al-Qaeda as an umbrella term, which many unfortunately do in America for all terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah, or a flippant reminder McCain has no idea what he's talking about, is unclear. Nonetheless, he has conflated the two, Sunni Wahhabists and Shia militants, as if they are one and the same. They are not, and are in fact in bloody opposition in the war over Syria. What McCain is doing is tantamount to confusing Protestants and Catholics in 17th century religious wars of Europe. This either speaks volumes of his ignorance or indifference to the fact that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates in Syria are doing most of the fighting, are strategically aligned with Assad's enemies, including the West, and stand the most benefit from a U.S.-led strike against Assad's asset, not the Free Syrian Army, whom John McCain met with clandestinely just a few months ago. The Daily Star thankfully cleared the air on one name, Ammar al-Dadiki, or Abu Ibrahim, the former leader of the Northern Storm Brigade, was actually wounded and allegedly died in Turkey months before the photo was taken. And Muaz Mustafa, executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, an American nonprofit that helped organize the McCain trip, said nobody self-identified as Noor and none of the guys who were standing outside were in the meeting with John McCain. The only problem is while Abu Ibrahim, the old leader of Northern Storm, was missing and presumed dead as the Daily Star reported, its new leader, Samir Alawan, whose organization still holds the 9 Shia Muslims, was in the meeting with Senator McCain. And as far as Mohammed Noor and his lack of self-identification are concerned, it's hard to envision a scenario in which he would be toting around his "I am a known terrorist" badge. This is, of course, not the first time John McCain has been caught literally palling around with terrorists, as the Daily Show's host Jon Stewart put it comically. For years, as Global Research notes, McCain has advocated, as he is in Syria, for groups either directly affiliated with or tacitly connected to Al-Qaeda franchises, and arguably in blatant violation of international law as well as in breach of U.S. terrorism legislation. In April of 2011, on a visit to Benghazi, Libya, John McCain claimed that the brave fighters he met there were not Al-Qaeda. To the contrary, they were Libyan patriots who wanted to liberate their nation. In an NPR interview that same month, McCain said, "They are my heroes." AFP reported not a year later, after Gaddafi was overthrown and Libya was in shambles, that Senator McCain and Lindsey Graham met with Abdel Hakim Belhaj, one of the rebellion's leading figures, and then head of the Tripoli Military Council. Belhaj, prior to and during the revolution in Libya, led the now defunct Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a confirmed affiliate of Al-Qaeda and responsible for the deaths of U.S. military personnel in Iraq during the U.S. occupation, according to an authoritative 2007 U.S. Military Academy report. LIFG is a terrorist organization on both the UN Security Council and the U.S. State Department lists. And as Tony Cartolucci points out, McCain was not only rhetorically supporting listed terrorists, but calling for material support, including weapons, funds, training, and air support in direct violation of USC's subparagraph 2339A and B, providing material support or resources to designated foreign terrorist organizations. Now, this material support McCain had sought for Libyan rebels, most of whom were from Benghazi, a hotbed of Islamic militancy, of which claimed the lives of 3 Americans and a U.S. ambassador a little over a year after John McCain gushed about his newfound friends. In the end, claiming ignorance is no excuse, but it is a clear example of the prevailing wisdom or lack thereof in Washington, and why American foreign policy is in perpetual failure. But John McCain's trip also reveals the larger, more interested powers behind the effort to oust the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The NGOs involved in Libya and Syria are just the tip of the iceberg.
Первое. Я не говорил, что США представляют для нас угрозу. Вот президент Обама, как вы сказали, считает Россию угрозой. Я не думаю, что США для нас представляют угрозу. Я думаю, что политика правящих кругов, как, извините, употреблю такой штамп, политика правящих кругов, она является ошибочной. И уверен, что она противоречит и нашим интересам, подрывает доверие к Соединенным Штатам, и в этом смысле наносит и Соединенным Штатам определенный ущерб. Подрывает к ним доверие как к одному из глобальных лидеров и в экономике, и в политике. Ну, можно, конечно, многие вещи замалчивать, но я же уже говорил об этом. И вот Доминик об этом вспоминал. Действия в одностороннем порядке и в последующем поиске союзников, создание коалиции после того, как все сделано. Но это ведь не способ договориться, правда? Это односторонние действия. И они применяются постоянно в текущей политике Соединенных Штатов. И приводят к кризисам. Я тоже об этом сказал. Вот президент Обама упомянул об одной из угроз, это ИГИЛ. Ну а кто помогал вооружать людей, которые в Сирии боролись с Асадом-то? Кто создавал благоприятный политический информационный климат? Кто подталкивал к поставкам оружия? А вы чего, разве вы не понимаете, кто там воюет? Там воюют наемники. В основном. Вы знаете, что там платят деньги? И они воюют там, где платят больше. Вот они вооружились, им платят определенную сумму. Мне даже называли эти суммы, которые им платят. Они там воюют уже с оружием, все, у них уже не отнимешь. Потом выяснилось, что в другом месте чуть-чуть начали побольше платить. Они там туда перетекут. Вот они захватили месторождения нефтяные, там, скажем, где-то в Ираке или в Сирии. Нефть начали добывать. У них эту нефть покупают, транспортируют, продают. Почему санкции не накладывают на всех, кто это делает? А что, разве Соединенные Штаты не знают, кто это делает? Это разве не их союзники этим занимаются? У них что, нет силы, возможности повлиять на своих союзников? Или они не хотят влиять? Зачем они бомбят ИГИЛ? Вот там начали нефть добывать и больше платить. И там часть сразу этих боевиков перетекла из так называемой цивилизованной оппозиции. Сразу же перетекла в ИГИЛ, потому что там больше платят. Я считаю, что это абсолютно невыверенная, непрофессиональная политика, без опоры на реалии. надо поддержать цивилизованную демократическую оппозицию в Сирии. Ну, поддержали, дали оружие, а завтра половина боевиков оттуда ушла и перешла в ИГИЛ. Что, нельзя было об этом подумать чуть-чуть пораньше? Вот мы против такой политики Соединенных Штатов. Мы считаем, что она ошибочна, наносит ущерб всем, в том числе и вам. Что касается учета наших интересов, то нам бы очень хотелось, чтобы такие как люди, как вы, возглавили Государственный департамент. И, может быть, тогда удастся как-то изменить ситуацию. Если этого не произойдет, я бы очень вас просил довести это до наших партнеров, и до президента Соединенных Штатов, и до госсекретаря, до других ответственных лиц, что мы не хотим, мы не ищем никакой конфронтации. Но вы считаете, что нужно уважать наши интересы, и многие вещи, они отрегулируются. Но это нужно сделать не на словах, а на деле. Уважать интересы других, с уважением относиться, это значит, что, как я уже говорил в своем выступлении, нельзя дожимать, используя свои исключительные положения в экономике там, и где-то в военной сфере. Понимаете, во всем. Ну хорошо, в Ираке там воюют, плохо. В Ливии там все довели до того, что вашего посла убили в Ливии. Мы что ли это сделали? Приняли решение в свое время Совета Безопасности. О чем? Значит, бесполетную зону сделать. Для чего? Для того, чтобы не могли летать самолеты Каддафи и бомбить боевиков. Тоже считаю не самое лучшее решение. Ну ладно. А что на самом деле сделали? Начали сами наносить удары, в том числе и по территории. Явное, грубое нарушение резолюции Совета Безопасности ООН. Практически агрессия без всякой резолюции. Это мы, что ли, сделали? Это же вы сделали своими руками. А закончилось чем? Убийством вашего посла. Кто виноват? Сами виноваты. Вот это хорошо для США, что посла убили. Ужасно, страшная катастрофа. Но не нужно искать виноватых, если сами допускаете ошибки. Нужно наоборот подняться над вот этим желанием бесконечно доминировать и исходить из вот этих имперских амбиций. Не нужно отравлять сознание миллионов людей тем, что другой политики в Соединенных Штатах быть не может, кроме имперской. Мы никогда не забудем того, как мы помогали Соединенным Штатам в обретении независимости. Мы никогда не забудем нашего сотрудничества и союзничества в Первую и во Вторую мировую войну. И я полагаю, что глубинные стратегические интересы американского народа, российского народа во многом совпадают. И нужно опираться вот на эти взаимные интересы.
The lies are flying out of Washington, spinning the takedown of Malaysia flight MH17 over Ukraine. And the liar-in-chief launched Russia's to blame right from the start.
Evidence indicates that the plane was shot down by a surface-to-air missile that was launched from an area that is controlled by Russian-backed separatists inside of Ukraine. Moreover, we know that these separatists have received a steady flow of support from Russia. This includes arms and training. It includes heavy weapons. And it includes anti-aircraft weapons.
Hold on. Russia says it would have been impossible to transport a huge mobile anti-aircraft missile system across Ukraine's eastern border secretly. It would have been like driving a tank through TSA. But Hillary says it's obvious who had such a system.
The Ukrainian government has been quick to blame it on terrorists, which is, their name for the Russian insurgents. And there does seem to be some growing awareness that it probably had to be Russian insurgents. The equipment had to have come from Russia.
Let's rewind and see what is obvious even to a fifth grader.
Number one, who could have shot it down?
Kiev.
Who had the equipment?
Kiev.
It's obviously an anti-aircraft missile.
Yep.
Who could have had the expertise?
Kiev. It's a fifth grade homework assignment. Look, Hillary, Kiev lied that it couldn't have fired a missile at the plane because it had no Buk missile launchers deployed in the region. That's a lie that you, Obama, and the Jewish-owned mainstream media are pushing. Here's a Kiev Buk battalion moving into the region of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, filmed during the Crimea crisis. During last week's takedown, the Russian Defense Ministry recorded evidence of Kiev's Buk M1 system operating within the zone of operation of the Ukrainian forces. But it's Putin's missile, says Murdoch's tabloid. And he'll have hell to pay, says Insane McCain.
If it is a result of either separatist or Russian action, I think there's going to be hell to pay, and there should be.
Here's what happened. The flight path of the plane was moved over the war zone by Ukraine's air traffic control. Ukraine's missile battery was in place, waiting for its prey. Jewish oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, who Yats the Yid appointed as governor of the Dnipropetrovsk region in eastern Ukraine, has his own hired militia, which most likely manned the battery and launched the missile that shot the plane down. You see, once the plane passed out of Kiev's airspace, it was handed to Dnipropetrovsk air traffic control. Remember, Kolomoisky is a dual citizen of Ukraine and Israel, with Malaysia's capital, Kuala Lumpur, recently charging Israel with war crimes. This would have been Kolomoisky's chance for revenge. The whole thing is a 9/11-style false flag operation to get NATO military support for Ukraine forces who are losing the ground war against the pro-Russian separatists. It's a mock-up emergency so that a quick, emotional decision can be made, just like Pearl Harbor, just like the Gulf of Tonkin, just like 9/11. Who benefits? The Jewish neocons for sure, headed by Nuland and gang, who have been thirsting for escalation since they engineered the overthrow of the legitimate government of Ukraine. Christian Russia wants peace, and that's the biggest threat to the Jewish neocons who want war. It's Putin's missile. It's Putin's inferno. It's Putin the evil czar, plastered all over the Jewish-owned press. But Russia's a bear whose cubs will fiercely defend the territory and honor of the motherland. We'll all have hell to pay if warmongering Jews have their way.
Shot in the back 4 times, just before midnight Moscow time. Boris Nemtsov was walking with a woman on a bridge close to the Kremlin. A witness says a car stopped and several people shot him. Nemtsov, 55, was a prominent opposition leader. In politics more than 20 years, rising to deputy premier in Boris Yeltsin's government and considered a possible successor. More recently, Nemtsov had founded the People's Freedom Party and was mounting a large opposition rally this Sunday in Moscow. Tonight, President Putin condemned the killing, but many will believe this was the work of assassins close to the government. Nemtsov was a sharp thorn in Putin's side, telling CBC in 2013 corruption in the Olympics was rife.
The Sochi Olympic Games is the biggest fraud in Putin time. The biggest. Putin, clown, etc., charismatic, I agree.
His fight with President Putin covered a decade, traveling abroad, including to Canada, to voice opposition. In 2011, shut out of running in the elections, he said Putin stole them.
Putin stole about 13 million votes.
Just a week ago, at a rally supporting the Kremlin, a picture of Nemtsov was held high, saying he helped organize Ukraine's uprising. Nemtsov himself told a Russian journalist he feared Putin would kill him because he opposed the war in Ukraine. In one of his last interviews, he said, 3 years ago, we were in opposition, now we're just dissidents. We have to rebuild.
Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV Alternative Media Television. It's March 2nd, 2015, and welcome to The Revolution. Allegedly, a Putin critic was shot dead on a bridge. He was gunned down by Putin, allegedly, according to the mainstream bullshit media that, by the way, has been trying to oust Putin over the past several years. Has even gone to the lengths of moving in cahoots with Saudi Arabia to drive down oil prices to put pressure on the Kremlin to crash and collapse the ruble, to send the economy into chaos. Now, question this for a minute. Why would Putin shoot openly a well-known opposition leader only to embolden and create a martyr for his own opposition? Again, the same thing happened with Bashar al-Assad in Syria when they tried to position the Ghouta chemical attack, but failed. It came out later from the United Nations, Carla Del Ponte, saying and accusing that it was actually the rebels armed and backed by the West on the ground, not the Bashar al-Assad government. Just like Bashar al-Assad wouldn't wish his own demise, nor would Putin. And allegedly, an opposition leader was killed by Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, which we know is total and utter bullshit. Again, there's no motive to do it. The mainstream media says it's because Putin wants to instill fear in his people. Well, I've got a newsflash for you. He doesn't need to instill fear in his people. His people actually, I think, are fearful of him and already do respect his leadership. In fact, he has overwhelming support in Russia, not just from the oligarchs that he represents, kind of like here in the United States of America, but also his people that, by the way, hate the United States of America. So, again, get your detectors out, your bullshit meters, total and utter bullshit. In fact, this hurts Putin. It's exactly why the West has positioned this. For example, let me give you an example, specific one. The President of the United States, Barack Obama, here in the good old USSA, has been openly assassinating and murdering Iranian nuclear scientists for some time now. It happened recently. A lot of these people just go missing or they wind up dead because the United States goes and kills them. While at the same time, the President of the United States is negotiating with Iran so that they can get a nuke, so that they can get a bomb within 10 years. As long as they're good. Yeah, that's right. As long as they're good, Obama's going to give them a nuke. While at the same time, he's openly murdering their scientists. Again, all of these just plain, utter facts. Kind of like Frank Underwood. You know, they released what's the show on Netflix? House of Cards. Over the weekend here, last Friday. He asked a question before drone striking. Are there any kids in that vehicle? And his defense minister says, yes, they are. Okay, pull the trigger. And he just whacks all of them, murders all of them. It's a total double standard how we try to paint Putin into a corner here. The Western bullshit media is some kind of Satan devil worshiper, while at the same time the president here in the United States is openly murdering scientists in Iran. Drone striking children, bombing schools as a result of these drone strikes in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and newly found Syria. So again, total bullshit. This would only hurt Putin. There's no motive for Putin to kill openly an opposition leader, to gun him down in broad daylight while he's walking with his model girlfriend on a bridge, because it only builds support for the opposition, and Putin is smarter than that. And again, the people already respect and fear him, so there would be no reason to do this.
I don't think Putin is a complicated man. He is a KGB thug. In his view, the greatest geopolitical disaster of modern times is the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Hey, Cruz, before you start calling a man 100 times better than you a thug, try dealing with facts. Putin's distress about the dissolution of the Soviet Union is the economic disaster and crushing hardship the Russian people endured in the 90s. And he's alarmed over the West's intrusion into former Soviet republics like Ukraine. As for Putin being a KGB thug, it's just another anti-Putin buzzword. Putin served in East Germany not as a thug, but as some historians say, to recruit new blood who would pledge to Gorbachev's reforms of perestroika and glasnost. Look it up. Putin was considered an outsider by the KGB old guard. We all know you're sucking up to the Jews, Cruz, so you can be next president. You pretend to be a Christian, but if you really were, you would applaud Putin for promoting the Orthodox Church in Russia and Christian values among the youth. Putin's a peacemaker, just as Christ commanded. Instead, Jewish neocons like your friend Crystal promote continual wars and political unrest. Whose side are you on, Mr. Cruz? It's time we all picked up sides. Will we side with warmongering Jews pushing us into a nuclear war with Russia? Or will we side with peacemakers around the world who've had enough of Jewish murders and genocide?
You also have said that the worst thing that happened last century was the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There are those who look at Ukraine, especially Ukraine and Georgia, and they believe that you do not want to recreate the Soviet Empire, but you do want to recreate a sphere of influence which you think Russia deserves because of the relationship that has existed. Why are you smiling? Why?
You're making me happy because we're always suspected of some ambitions, and they always try to distort something or hint at something. I indeed said that I believe that the collapse of the USSR was a huge tragedy of the 20th century. You know why? Because first of all, in a single instant, 25 million Russian people found themselves beyond the borders of the Russian Federation. Here they had been living within the borders of a unified state, and always traditionally the Soviet Union had been called Russia, Soviet Russia. Well, this was Greater Russia. Then all of a sudden the USSR collapsed, just overnight in fact, right? And it's turned out that in former Soviet republics there were people, Russian people, numbering 25 million. They had been living in a single country, and all of a sudden they turned out to be abroad. You can imagine how many problems arose. First of all, there were everyday problems, economic problems, social problems, the separation of families. You can't list them all. Do you think it's normal that 25 million people, Russian people, wound up abroad all of a sudden? Russians turned out to be the largest divided nation in the world today. Is that not a problem? Well, not for you, but it's a problem for me.
But do you have to use and show military force to accomplish that objective?
No, of course not.
You have a military presence on the border of Ukraine, and some even argue that there have been Russian troops in Ukraine.
Well, you have a military presence in Europe.
Yes.
The tactical nuclear weapons of the United States are in Europe. Let's not forget that. What does that mean? Does it mean that you've occupied Germany? Or that you renounced the occupation of Germany after World War II? And then you have only transformed the occupation forces into NATO forces? One could put it that way, but we're not putting it that way. And if we have our military forces on our border, on our territory, on the border with some state, you believe this is a crime?
It's been called Frankenstein food, while the science behind it is accused of dangerously toying with nature. And in Russia, it could be branded terrorist. Genetically modified food and its potential negative health effects are making Russia take steps. RT's Igor Piskunov explains what's behind the harsh measures to criminalize producers.
Pictures like these are becoming common in different parts of the globe. In the US, Canada, Brazil, Germany, and China, GM foods are beginning to dominate entire sections of the market. For instance, up to 85% of corn and around 90% of soybeans are genetically modified in the States alone. After entering the World Trade Organization, Russia was also planning to widen its GM foods market, but now the country is making a U-turn on the policy.
We have to protect our citizens from GMO products, and we can do it without violating our obligations to the WTO.
According to Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, Moscow isn't going to allow planting genetically modified seeds this summer like it was planned before. Parliament has also weighed in on the issue. Legislators are currently looking at increasing the punishment for breaking GMO-related laws, including hiding or distorting information on GM products, which could cause physical damage. Their idea is to equal such an offense to terrorism with maximum jail time of 20 years. GM products are still available in Russian stores, but perhaps what we're witnessing now are the first steps for their complete ban altogether. Igor Piskunov, RT, Moscow.
Russian President Putin angrily refused to see Secretary of State John Kerry and kept him waiting about 3 hours. And when he did see him, it was reported that President Putin was so enraged that he sent a message to President Obama condemning his obvious support of genetically modified organisms.
He used to think that for gay and lesbian couples, civil unions would suffice. But now President Obama has concluded that's not enough. In an ABC News interview, he became the first president ever to support gay marriage.
For me personally, it is important for me to go ahead and affirm that I think same-sex couples should be able to get married.
The religion of Vladimir Putin is based on the idea of Orthodox Christian civilization. Christ is present and pleased when men seek to build the kingdom of God on earth. This is according to the Orthodox tradition of symphony of church and state, where the church is the soul and the state is the body. The church prepares men for heaven, while the state preserves the culture as transformed by the church. It's a partnership building a strong Russian nation.
Также важно, что на новом уровне развиваются государственно-церковные отношения. Мы выступаем как подлинные партнеры и как соработники в решении самых актуальных внутренних, да и международных задач. В развитии совместных начинаний на благо нашего Отечества и нашего народа. Россия столетиями строилась крепла как многонациональное и многоконфессиональное государство.
As head of the nation's body, Putin is known by his people as a key member of the Russian Orthodox Church. Only a born-again type would say, a man inside a church doesn't make him a Christian any more than a man inside a garage makes him a car. But Orthodoxy teaches that if one is not a member inside the church, then he's not connected to the church's head, the Lord Jesus Christ. After a phone call with Putin on the Ukraine crisis, the Jewish press reported that Merkel said that Putin was in another world, out of touch with reality. That's not what she said. What she said was, Putin has a completely different view of the world. Indeed, he does.
В эти дни Русская Православная Церковь, весь православный мир отмечают 1025-летие крещения Руси. И позвольте мне в начале нашей встречи принятие христианства предопределило судьбу и цивилизационный выбор России. Православие стало духовной опорой, связало крепкими родственными узами Россию, Украину и Беларусь.
The West, though, has lost its vigor. It's now the haunt of Jewry, which has devastated its culture with depravity. It's at the end of history, a ghost of old forms bereft of the soul it once possessed. It's swept clean, and 7 demons have entered in its place. This is not the case with Russia. After 70 years of Jewish Bolshevik oppression, Russia is pulsing in the womb of rebirth and renewal, where Orthodox churches with its golden domes and sky blue cupolas, Christian schools, and holy monasteries are sprouting throughout its cities and dotting its countrysides. God and the devil are at war, said Dostoevsky, and the battlefield is the heart of man. Putin has drawn the battle lines. He rebuked the West for its deviant sexual mores and sick spirituality.
Сегодня во многих странах пересматриваются нормы морали и нравственности. Стираются национальные традиции и различия наций и культур. От общества теперь требуют не только здравого признания права каждого на свободу совести, политических взглядов и частной жизни, но и обязательного признания равноценности, как это не покажется странным, добра и зла, противоположных по смыслу понятий.
But Obama, with Jewish children at his side selling sodomy, extols homosexuals for charting a course for a sick new world.
Third, we ask the President for his support of gay marriage, because we have...
We're almost done.
because we have two moms and they are just as good as other parents.
Welcome, all of you, to the White House for Pride Month. We've got some outstanding members of Congress here, including a record number from the Congressional Equality Caucus. Major General Patricia Rose and her wife, retired Lieutenant Julie Roth, are here. We've got Fred Hochberg and Elaine Kaplan, two outstanding members of my team who are here. I want to congratulate Nitza Quiñones Alejandro, who just a few hours ago was confirmed by the Senate, making her the first openly gay Hispanic federal judge in our country's history.
Вы знаете, я не берусь ответить на...
You know, I can't answer the part of your question about whether homosexuals are born or made.
Люди рождаются или становятся гомосексуалистами.
That is beyond my professional interest. I'm just not qualified to respond.
Квалифицированного ответа я просто не смогу дать. Обращаю ваше внимание на то, что в России нет уголовной
I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in Russia, unlike in one-third of world's countries, being gay is not a crime.
В 70 странах мира предусмотрена уголовная
In
ответственность.
70 countries, there is criminal liability for homosexuality, and in 7 of those countries, they have the death penalty for homosexuality.
Принят недавно только закон, запрещающий пропаганду.
We have recently passed a law prohibiting propaganda, and not of homosexuality only, but of homosexuality and child abuse, child sexual abuse.
Вот,
But this is nothing to do with persecuting individuals for their sexual orientation.
за их сексуальную ориентацию. Это две большие разницы, как у нас говорят.
There is a world of difference between these two things, so there is no danger for individuals of this non-traditional sexual orientation who are planning to come to the games as visitors or participants.
В качестве гостей либо участников Олимпиады не существует.
What about the Russian church people who have called for the return of criminal law against homosexual people? Do you support that? Are you horrified by it? What's your attitude?
Значит, у нас церковь по закону отделена от государства.
In law, the church is separate from the state and has the right to its own point of view.
Обращаю ваше внимание также на то, что
I would also like to point out that almost all traditional world religions agree on this topic.
Занимают солидарную позицию по этой теме. А что, разве позиция
Is the position of the Holy See different from that of the Russian Orthodox Church?
от позиции Русской Православной Церкви? А разве ислам как-то по-другому?
Does Islam treat individuals with non-traditional sexual orientation differently?
Другая позиция заключается в гораздо более
Actually, it's even tougher.
Вы внимательно прочитайте закон и посмотрите.
Read our law carefully and pay attention to its name.
Пропаганда педофилии.
It's called a ban on the propaganda of pedophilia and homosexuality.
Педофилии, пропаганда.
Ban on the propaganda of pedophilia and homosexuality.
В некоторых странах, в том числе в Европе,
there are countries, including in Europe, where they are debating the possibility of legalizing pedophilia.
Легализация педофилии. Публично в парламентах обсуждают.
Publicly discussing this in parliament. They can do what they want, but the people of Russia have their own cultural code, their own traditions.
Своя традиция. Мне кажется, что тот закон, который у нас
It seems to me that the law we adopted doesn't harm anybody. What's more, people, homosexual people, can't feel inferior here, because there is no professional, career or social discrimination against them. When they achieve great success, for example, Elton John is an extraordinary person, a distinguished musician, and millions of our people sincerely love him, regardless of his sexual orientation.
While everyone was obsessing over Caitlyn Jenner, Cecil the Lion and Donald Trump, the United States was accelerating its plan to provoke a colour revolution in Russia that could lead to a toppling of Putin's government and a complete reordering of the international power structure. As I first highlighted last month, Russian Parliament member Yevgeny Fedorov went public to reveal a plot on behalf of the US State Department to contrive a staged Kiev-style revolution that would force Putin to step down and lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation within 2 years.
Они ведут переговорный процесс с российскими элитами о выдаче Путина. Так же, как они вели такой же переговорный процесс по Януковичу.
Fedorov asserts that Russian oligarchs have been paid off to facilitate this coup, which will involve hundreds of thousands of people flooding the streets of Moscow to start a violent rebellion against Putin after a further collapse in the Russian economy causes food prices to soar.
После августа, я думаю, что через зиму, через падение жизненного уровня, им удастся к весне вытащить на улицы несколько сотен тысяч человек, как в Армении. И просто потому, что с помощью правительства они резко обрушат жизненный уровень людей, особенно после зимы. Чтобы устроить бунт, ну, нужно там 1100-200 просто голодных людей, как в Армении, из которых там 90% может быть и в темную использовано, но при этом они организованы. То есть им как бы не говорят, что они на американцев, им просто говорят, вот вы голодные, выходите.
Fedorov's revelations were confirmed by the fact that Moscow is now banning organizations from Russia that were involved in the Ukrainian coup d'etat, including the National Endowment for Democracy and Freedom House. As F. William Engdahl notes, the NED, along with Freedom House, has been at the center of all US State Department-financed color revolutions in the world since 2000, when it was used to topple Milosevic in Serbia. This action was taken after Putin signed into law a measure which effectively criminalizes the activity of non-governmental organizations that threaten to undermine Russia's constitutional stability. China also recently passed a new law which restricts the activities of foreign NGOs. The two superpowers are finally waking up to the fact that regime change plots in the modern age are achieved not via bombs and tanks, but via mass subversion. Expect to see an intensification of the propaganda campaign against Russia over the next few months, starting with the blame game being laid at Moscow's door for the downing of flight MH17. Some will be skeptical as to how a president with an approval rating in the high 80s could possibly be overthrown. But the very fact that NATO and the White House are even considering this illustrates their staggering disconnect with reality, which, blinded by neo-colonial imperatives, threatens to place the world in the most dangerous jeopardy since the height of the Cold War.
What he meant by calling it revisionist Russia?
Revisionist Russia?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, the secretary?
Yeah, Secretary Hagel.
I think what he's referring to there is that that there appears to be in their intentions and their motives a calling back to the glory days of the Soviet Union.
He also used that phrase, that its army, meaning Russia's army, on NATO's doorstep. Why is that? Is it not logical to look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding? That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO? Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for...
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to, moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern
I'm
states.
pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
it's not
okay.
changed. But I'm
So,
pretty sure the movement by Russia is Russia's decision.
if NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved. Not
NATO
because
is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
Unfortunately, for 50 years, it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So
Where's
do you
the
not
Soviet
understand
Union
it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians would perceive it as a threat, and the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border while their troops I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida. Right. What I can tell you is that NATO is a defensive alliance. It remains a defensive alliance.
Fair enough, but it has moved east. Correct? I mean, that's just a fact.
It has expanded, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
But there's no reason for anybody to think the expansion is a hostile or threatening move. And we've been saying that throughout the last 15 years, man.
It's like you're moving closer to Russia, yet you're blaming the Russians for being close to NATO.
No.
That's exactly what Hagel said.
We're blaming the Russians for violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine and destabilizing the security situation inside Europe.
Which is not a NATO.
I see
other countries feel threatened that are NATO members.
All the puppet governments, led by Israel's bitch, America, are lining up to wage yet another war for the Jews, this time in Syria. It began last week when Netanyahu, citing Assad's reported use of chemical weapons, incited America to launch Stage 1 of World War III in a bombing operation on Syria.
The reported use of chemical weapons against civilians in Syria is terribly disturbing. And these events prove yet again that we simply cannot allow the world's most dangerous regimes to acquire the world's most dangerous weapons.
And all the players, from Jerusalem, England, France, all the way to Tel Aviv's colony in D.C., are acting out the Jewish script. Destroy Assad and let Al-Qaeda take over. Kind of strange. The bad guys in Afghanistan become the good guys in Syria. But when the Jewish tail wags the American dog, a ready submission to Zionist warmongers enters center stage.
Brushing aside Assad's denials, the administration's goal is to punish him and stop him from ordering another chemical attack.
There is no doubt who is responsible for this heinous use of chemical weapons in Syria. The Syrian regime.
The White House says it will release solid evidence that the Syrian government ordered a mass chemical weapons attack on its own people last week.
And here's the evidence we've all been waiting for from Obama himself, who's not quite sure if what he concludes is really all that conclusive.
Nobody disputes, or hardly anybody disputes, that chemical weapons were used on a large scale in Syria against civilian populations. We have looked at all the evidence, and we do not believe the opposition possessed nuclear weapons of that, or chemical weapons of that sort. We do not believe that, given the delivery systems using rockets, that the opposition could have carried out these attacks. We have concluded that the Syrian government, in fact, carried these out. And if that's so, at
the Jewish-run State Department, Kerry said just what Tel Aviv wanted to hear. Syria is the culprit. No evidence provided.
Our understanding of what has already happened in Syria is grounded in facts, informed by conscience, and guided by common sense. We know that the Syrian regime maintains custody of these chemical weapons. We know that the Syrian regime has the capacity to do this with rockets. And despite the excuses and equivocations that some have manufactured, it is undeniable.
No way. Russia says the rebels orchestrated a provocation with their own stash of nerve gas in order to force Israel's bitch, the USA, into launching an attack on Assad, whose secular government protects all minorities, including Christians, Kurds, and Druze.
Russia has warned the West against military intervention in Syria without the approval of the UN Security Council. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the West is currently moving toward a, quote, very dangerous path, adding that any unilateral attack on Syrian soil would violate international law. Lavrov says Western countries have no proof that the Syrian government used chemical weapons in its fight against insurgents. The Russian foreign minister described Western claims of chemical weapons as hysteria.
In concert with Lavrov's protestations, Carla Del Ponte, member of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, told Swiss TV on Tuesday there are strong, concrete suspicions that the rebels, not Assad, unleashed the deadly nerve gas. Assad dismisses the accusations as nonsense, that Syria would never release chemical weapons in an area where government troops were concentrated. But it's nonsense that America wants the world to swallow in order to give the Jews a balkanized state on its east, with competing jihadis vying for power under the all-seeing eye of the U.S. military. Not quite what the Quran envisions for holy war. Intensifying the terrorist network across the Middle East serves to further Jewish aim to see Christianity destroyed in the Arab world, and to spread a terrorist web into Russia's underbelly and China's Muslim frontier in Xinjiang as a means of destabilizing those two anti-Zionist countries. It's a Jewish cause for which every American will die for. Split the axis opposing Zionist aggression down the middle, from Lebanon's Hezbollah on Israel's north, through Syria in the center, to Iran in the east, and a pathway for the imperialist, antichrist Jewish state to run roughshod over the entire Middle East is set. Assad has ordered his forces to defend the homeland with their Russian-made Yakout missiles, to be fired upon U.S. ships stationed on Syria's coast in the Mediterranean. To be sure, he's defending his country against Jewish aggression, for which the U.S. military is just a pawn. For it's the same Jewish warmongers who pushed our military into Iraq who are calling for the bombing of Syria, signing their names to an open letter to Obama. Feith, Lieberman, Cohen, Abrams, Crystal, Kagan. Sounds like a guest list to a fatal bar mitzvah. They even got their artsy Jewish poster boy from France, Bernard Henry Levy, to affix his signature. But thank God we're beginning to see a fallout. The Arab League is against military intervention. Egypt rejects it. NATO member Poland wants no part of it. Italy insists the UN must decide. Britain's parliament is opposing Cameron. And Jordan won't let America use their territory as a launching pad for its bombings. We've got our own problems to deal with at home instead of sending our youth to die in wars for the Jews halfway across the world. And why should the U.S. punish a nation for alleged war crimes that itself is far more guilty of? What if countries wanted to punish America for its own war crimes? They could come up with 100 reasons to justify it. The empire has no clothes. Pax America is dying. Pax Judaica rises in its place. Fighting wars for the Jews abroad leaves a sick and dying empire licking its wounds at home.
А как вы считаете, правильно ли поступают те, кто поддерживает вооруженную оппозицию?
Well, tell me, do you think those who support an armed opposition, and mainly the terrorist organizations, only in order to oust Assad are acting correctly, without concern about what will happen from the outside after all the government institutions have been totally demolished in that country? We've already been through that. I've already mentioned Libya. Just now, it was quite recently, the United States actively helped to destroy the state institutions, whether they were good or bad. That's a separate issue. But now, they're destroyed, and now the United States has suffered great losses. The death of their ambassador, for instance. You see what it all leads us to. That's why we support the legitimate state structures. But I want to repeat this once again, in the hope that the needed political reforms will be taken and introduced in Syria. You've said repeatedly that Assad is fighting against his own people. But look at those who control 60% of the territory in Syria.
Вы посмотрите, кто контролирует 60% территории Сирии. Где это?
Where is the civilized opposition? 60% of the territory is controlled either by ISIS or by others, such as al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations. They're recognized as terrorist organizations by the United States, by other states, and by the United Nations. It's they and no one else who controls 60% of the Syrian territories.
But you believe that the way to do it is what? What's the strategy that you are recommending other than simply supporting the Assad regime?
Да, я уже об этом сказал. Мы должны помочь армии Асада
Well, yes, I've already said this. We need to help Assad's army because, besides his army, no one is fighting ISIS in Syria. I want you and your audience to finally realize that no one except for Assad's army is fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups now in Syria. No one is fighting them in Syria. And these insignificant attacks from the air, including the bombings by the US, don't bring any tangible solution to the issue. There must be work on the ground after the bombing. It must be coordinated. We need to understand which attacks and where they must be launched, and who will come after these strikes are made on the territory. In Syria, there is no other force beside the army of Bashar al-Assad.
What else is going to be required? Because I come back to the problem that many people look at, and they believe that Assad helps ISIS, that his reprehensible conduct against the Syrian people using barrel bombs and worse is a recruiting tool for ISIS, and that he was removed, transitioned at some point. It would be better in the fight against ISIS, al-Nusra, and others.
Выражаясь профессиональным языком спецслужб, могу сказать, что такая оценка.
Well, speaking in the professional language of intelligence services, I can tell you that this kind of assessment is clearly an active measure by enemies of Assad. That is anti-Syrian propaganda. There's nothing in common between Assad and ISIL. They have nothing in common. They're fighting each other. And let me repeat, Assad and his army is the only force which is indeed fighting ISIL.
During our investigation for crimes against humanity and war crimes, we collect some witness testimony that that made to appear that some chemical weapons were used, in particular nervine gas, and what appeared on to our investigation that that was used by the opponents, by the rebels, and we have no indication at all that the government, Syria, the authority of the Syria government have used chemical weapons. Of course, now the special commission that the Secretary General put in place will investigate and tell us what it is exactly. But I was a little bit stupefied that the first indication we got they were about the use of nervine gas by the opponents.
Достаточно посмотреть на ситуацию на Ближнем Востоке и в Северной Африке, о чем говорил предыдущий выступающий. Конечно, политические, социальные проблемы в этом регионе назревали давно, и люди там, конечно, хотели перемен. Но что получилось на деле? Агрессивное внешнее вмешательство привело к тому, что вместо реформ государственные институты, да и сам уклад жизни были просто бесцеремонно разрушены. Вместо торжества демократии и прогресса – насилие, нищета, социальная катастрофа. А права человека, включая и право на жизнь, ни во что не ставятся. Так и хочется спросить тех, кто создал такую ситуацию. Вы хоть понимаете теперь, чего вы натворили? Но, боюсь, этот вопрос повиснет в воздухе, потому что от политики, в которой лежит самоуверенность, убежденность в своей исключительности и безнаказанность, так и не отказались. Уже очевидно, что возникший в ряде стран Ближнего Востока и Северной Африки вакуум власти привел к образованию зон анархии, которые немедленно стали заполняться экстремистами и террористами. Под знаменами так называемого исламского государства уже воюют десятки тысяч боевиков. В их числе бывшие иракские военнослужащие, которые в результате вторжения в Ирак в 2003 году были выброшены на улицу. Поставщиком рекрутов является и Ливия, чья государственность была разрушена в результате грубого нарушения резолюции 1973 Совбеза ООН. А сейчас ряды радикалов пополняют и члены так называемой умеренной сирийской оппозиции, поддержанной Западом. Их сначала вооружают, обучают, а потом они переходят на сторону так называемого исламского государства. Да и само исламское государство возникло не на пустом месте. Его также поначалу пестовали как орудие против неугодных светских режимов. Создав плацдарм в Сирии и Ираке, исламское государство активно расширяет экспансию на другие регионы. Нацеливается на господство в исламском мире. И не только там. Только этими планами явно не ограничиваются. Положение дел более чем опасно. В такой ситуации лицемерно и безответственно выступать с громогласными декларациями об угрозе международного терроризма и при этом закрывать глаза на каналы финансирования и поддержки террористов, в том числе за счет наркобизнеса, нелегальной торговли нефтью, оружием, либо пытаться манипулировать экстремистскими группировками, ставить их себе на службу для достижения собственных политических целей, в надежде потом как-нибудь разобраться с ними, а попросту говоря, ликвидировать. Тем, кто действительно так поступает и так думает, хотел бы сказать: уважаемые господа, вы имеете дело, конечно, с очень жестокими людьми, но вовсе не с глупыми и не с примитивными. Они не глупее вас, и еще неизвестно, кто кого использует в своих целях. И последние данные о передаче оружия этой самой умеренной оппозиции террористам – лучшее тому подтверждение. Считаем любые попытки заигрывать с террористами, а тем более вооружать их, не просто недальновидными, а пожароопасными. В результате глобальная террористическая угроза может критически возрасти, охватить новые регионы планеты. Тем более, что в лагерях исламского государства проходят обкатку боевики из многих стран, в том числе из европейских. К сожалению, должен сказать об этом прямо, уважаемые коллеги, и Россия не является здесь исключением. Нельзя допустить, чтобы эти головорезы, которые уже почувствовали запах крови, потом вернулись к себе домой и там продолжили свое черное дело. Мы этого не хотим, ведь этого никто не хочет, не так ли? Россия всегда твердо и последовательно выступала против терроризма во всех его формах. Сегодня мы оказываем военно-техническую помощь и Ираку, и Сирии, другим странам региона, которые ведут борьбу с террористическими группировками. Считаем огромной ошибкой отказ от сотрудничества с сирийскими властями, правительственной армией, с теми, кто мужественно лицом к лицу сражается с террором. Надо, наконец, признать, что кроме правительственных войск президента Асада, а также курдского ополчения в Сирии с исламским государством и другими террористическими организациями, реально никто не борется. Мы знаем все проблемы региона, все противоречия, но нужно все-таки исходить из реалий. Уважаемые коллеги, вынужден заметить, что такой наш честный и прямой подход в последнее время используется как предлог, чтобы обвинить Россию в растущих амбициях. Как будто у тех, кто говорит об этом, нет вообще никаких амбиций. Но суть не в амбициях России, уважаемые коллеги, а в том, что терпеть складывающееся в мире положение уже невозможно.
The Russian Air Force has begun airstrikes against ISIL positions in Syria after Russia's upper house of parliament voted to authorize military operations in the Arab state. Russia's defense ministry confirmed that the attacks are being conducted at the request of Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad. Syrian officials say that the airstrikes are necessary to safeguard the Middle East and Russia in the face of further terror.
The airstrike, launched on Wednesday, September 30th, targeted ammunition, vehicles, communication centers, and military equipment. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Wednesday during a government meeting that his country would not get caught up in the Syrian conflict. American officials said Russia gave the U.S. advance notice of the strike.
This is significant. Getting reports minutes ago that Russia has launched airstrikes in Syria, demanding the U.S. planes get out of Syrian airspace. These fast-moving developments further complicating relations between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the middle.
According to Russia's defense ministry, its warplanes have already destroyed ISIL weapon depots, communication centers, and military vehicles. Russia's military operations in Syria could give government forces the edge they need to end the stalemate and push ISIL out of the country.
This next headline, I can't believe I'm actually going to read it, but it's no shock. The neocons in the United States government are dead set on getting everybody in America killed, driving us deeper and deeper into war with Russia and headlong into World War III. John McCain has said we must arm the Syrian rebels to shoot down the Russian planes just like we did in Afghanistan. This is no joke.
Senator, if you were president in the middle of all of this, and you know, or you're charging as you did just now, and I assume you know more than I do, that the Russian fighters are targeting the very groups we are trying to help, would you shoot down those Russian planes?
No, but I would certainly make it clear. Well, I would do a whole lot of things. General David Petraeus testified before the Armed Services Committee 2 weeks ago. He laid out what we need to do. We need to stop the barrel bombing. We need to have a no-fly zone. We need to have a buffer zone for refugees. We need to provide certain
I know
kinds
that,
of
Senator,
help.
but if they're attacking the very guys who we want to see topple Assad, you would let American planes just continue to pass them and let them do that?
No, but I might do what we did in Afghanistan many years ago to give those guys the ability to shoot down those planes. That equipment is available.
Who would be shooting them down?
The Free Syrian Army, just like the Afghans shot down the Russian. No, just like the Afghans shot down Russian planes after Russia invaded Afghanistan.
The US president has slammed Russian airstrikes against ISIL in Syria, going as far as saying Moscow's campaign is only making the terror group stronger. Let's go live right now to RT's Marina Portnaya. Hi, Marina. So Barack Obama has said that anti-ISIL strikes are good for ISIL. Tell us more.
That's right. In his first public comments since Russia launched anti-ISIL airstrikes into Syria, U.S. President Barack Obama was harsh and very critical. He insisted that Moscow's military operation is counterproductive. He said that President Vladimir Putin is not distinguishing between ISIL and the moderate opposition. Obama accused the Russian Air Force of specifically targeting Syrian rebels, and he insisted that from Russia's perspective, everyone opposed to Syrian President Bashar Assad is a terrorist.
Moderate opposition in Syria is one that, if we're ever going to have a political transition, we need. And the Russian policy is driving those folks underground or creating a situation in which they are decapacitated, and it's only strengthening ISIL.
America's leader said the U.S. will continue going after ISIL and working with the Syrian opposition. However, Obama did say that he will be the first to admit that his training and equipment program for the Syrian opposition has not worked the way it was supposed to. Now, when President Putin spoke to the United Nations General Assembly earlier this week, he proposed the creation of one unified broad coalition to defeat ISIS, a suggestion that the U.S. president appears to be playing down.
The problem here is Assad and the brutality that he's inflicted on the Syrian people, and that it has to stop.
Now, however, when it comes to getting more involved in Syria, such as putting boots on the ground, Obama says that America does need to learn from the mistakes of Afghanistan and Iraq and not commit to starting something that it cannot finish.
Iran and Assad make up Mr. Putin's coalition at the moment. The rest of the world makes up ours.
Now, Obama said that it is in the U.S.'s best interest for Russia to be successful in Syria and to be an active partner on the international stage. He said that Syria will not be turned into a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. He said that would not be in anyone's best interest. But as you could hear from his comments, very harsh comments, he is not in support of this anti-ISIL operation that Russia launched earlier this week.
Listen, Syria, just next door to where you are, you're talking to people on the ground there in Syria as far as the question. And Chris John pointed out, you know, the inaccuracy in what we just heard. You know, Russia says it's targeting ISIS, and obviously that's not the case.
It's not, according to a number of activists that we have been speaking to. In fact, a lot of these areas, especially those that were targeted north of Homs, right along the north-south, very strategic highway, were areas that the Assad regime itself in the last month has been pounding fairly intensely as well. And, you know, Russia's involvement in all of this at this stage does really shift the dynamics. Christian was pointing it out as well, and it also in the sense that it could possibly push more people towards ISIS. But what is also going to be very critical right now is how the U.S. is going to react to these moves by Russia if they are in fact able to 100% determine, ascertain that Russia was not bombing ISIS.
We hear U.S. officials say that Russia is not targeting ISIL. The State Department spokesperson sounded quite certain about this. He said, quote, "We have no indication that they're actually hitting ISIL targets." But how does he know this? We have the list of the cities that Russia has targeted. It includes Raqqa, which is known to be the de facto capital of the Islamic State, Idlib, which the U.S. itself targeted in July of this year, Homs, where in August more than 200 civilians were kidnapped by ISIL, and that the State Department issued a statement condemning this. Can the State Department say for certain that there was no ISIL to target in those places? I asked.
One of the cities that Russia has targeted is Raqqa. Would you say that Raqqa is ISIL-free?
No, and in fact, I said I think I said the preponderance of.
Okay, let's look at other cities. Okay, I heard that. What about Idlib? Is it ISIL-free? That's another city that Russia has targeted.
Okay, catch your breath. So what we've seen in the initial airstrikes that Russia carried out beginning last week were primarily targeting places where ISIL wasn't ensconced, didn't exist, didn't have a presence. And frankly, it was where moderate Syrian opposition forces are generally located.
So the U.S. claims that Russia is targeting moderate elements in the Syrian opposition. Just a little while ago, we heard U.S. officials say how difficult it is to identify those moderate opposition forces.
We're trying to recruit and identify people that, as you put it, can be counted on. It turns out to be very hard to identify.
A month ago, the U.S. couldn't find enough adequate moderate opposition forces to train and equip. And after the Russian airstrikes, all of a sudden we hear that there are so many of them that we hear about the Free Syrian Army. We haven't heard the words Free Syrian Army for months, and all of a sudden they're back. Why couldn't you find them before?
That's a mischaracterization. So we're talking about rather two separate entities. The Free Syrian Army is a group of moderate Syrian opposition forces in combat with the Syrian regime, with Assad's army, with Assad's military. What we were trying to, our train and equip program in northern Syria, where ISIL is ensconced, was to try to find moderate elements in that area and train them up.
Do you know where exactly those moderate Syrian opposition forces are?
Without revealing intelligence sources, we have a pretty good sense of it, yeah.
Can you share that information with Russia?
Oh.
Not with us.
I'm going to share it with this podium.
Video published online purports to show scenes of destruction in the Islamic State-held city of Raqqa in northern Syria on Tuesday, following what is said to be Russian airstrikes. In the video, large plumes of smoke were seen rising from tall buildings and bridges, where huge craters and burnt-out vehicles blocked the passageway. The video also showed what was said to be a damaged hospital, where chairs and wooden boards remained scattered along its corridors.
This morning, RT interviewed the Director of Operations at the International Committee of the Red Cross, Dominique Stillhart, and we asked him about allegations that Russia bombed hospitals in Syria, and he said that Red Cross personnel on the ground in Syria have not reported any such incidents. Do you have any evidence that Russia bombed hospitals in Syria?
We have seen some press reporting to that end. We have seen some Syrian civil society groups say that. And I would tell you that we have other operational information that lead us to believe that that Russian targeting has not only not been focused on ISIL, but has in fact caused collateral damage and some civilian casualties, to include some civil infrastructure. And so, yes, we've seen some information that would lead us to believe that Russian military aircraft did hit a hospital.
Can you share evidence of that? Those
No,
are
I
very
can-
serious allegations. Reports are not enough, are they? Can you offer
I think I just
something
did.
more solid than reports?
I think I just did. I said we have operational reporting that would lead us to believe that that's the case.
Can you share that?
No, I'm not going to
evidence?
talk about. I'm not going to share intelligence and operational information here from this podium. You asked me a very direct question. I gave you a direct answer. We have reason to believe that happened.
Can you really offer no details on the hospital that the U.S. accuses Russia of hitting?
We're going to stand by Mr. Kirby's words.
You're not even going to say where it is, that hospital that you are saying Russia hit?
What we're saying is that we have seen information that Russia is targeting civilian infrastructure.
But
and we would point you to the
he spoke about
Syrian NGOs on the ground, as well as open source reporting on that.
He spoke about a specific hospital in Syria. Where exactly is it? What details can you offer about that hospital?
Again, I'm not going to get into this sort of detail of operational assessment for this. Maybe you should speak to the Russians on their targeting.
Well, they have.
Clearly, either she or her colleagues have spoken to the Russians about it, and they say
point.
that you're wrong.
Mhm.
Okay? Isn't it incumbent on you to come up with some, even a location? It doesn't seem like it would be that difficult or violate any kind of intelligence sources and methods to say where exactly it is that you're talking about when you make the accusation. That's the first thing, and then the second thing is you just expanded it quite broadly to say not just hospitals. You said that the Russians are actually targeting civilian infrastructure.
Thank you, Matt. Actually, the Russians have hit. Thank you for the
Are they
clarification.
targeting?
No, they've hit. And I
Okay, so
appreciate that.
they're
They are
not targeting civilian infrastructure?
No, and thank
Okay.
you for that.
Ma'am, well, details are especially relevant. This morning, the Russian Defense Ministry has released images and video of the hospital in Sarmin, which was allegedly hit by Russia. And these images, they show the building of the hospital, which doesn't look like it was recently bombed. I printed them out just in case you haven't seen them. I can show them. Can you see why it's important for the U.S. to show its evidence of the alleged destruction of a hospital by Russia?
How about this? I'll take your question. If there's information we can share, we'll get back to you. Okay.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights Monitoring Group said on Tuesday that Russian warplanes carried out airstrikes in Hama province, while unidentified jets bombarded the outskirts of Raqqa.
Well, since Russia's air campaign began in Syria, many Western media outlets such as CNN and Al Jazeera have been heavily relying on information from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that 30 people, including child soldiers, have been killed.
One human rights group says Russian airstrikes killed 28 people.
Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said 36 people were killed.
Well, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights was founded in May 2006, and it's run by one man, Rami Abdulrahman, a Syrian immigrant based in his home in Coventry in England. RT first travelled to the Midlands to see his headquarters and speak with the founder.
I'm asking you, I called you in the morning. I'm not staying here for long. I'm not publishing the address.
I know. But I am not in my home, and only my daughter and my wife. How you can lock him and you make him staring?
I apologize. I'm not going to bother them. So they're trying to kill you. Okay.
Let me tell you one thing. I am in Kazakhstan. You know Kazakhstan where is
I think that's the man. So now we definitely know that the head of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is here, and we're going to ask him a couple of questions. Hello, sir. Yeah. Do you have a couple of minutes?
We are under attack simply because we tell the truth about what's going on in Syria. Apparently, nobody wants to hear the truth.
Do you know these people working in Syria, hundreds you say personally? You mentioned money just now. Political standing naturally plays a certain role too. People may have totally different interests. Can you really trust all of them?
I know all of the activists working for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights.
You keep saying that you know all these people personally. When was the last time you went to Syria?
The last time I was in Syria was in 2000. But I know some of the observatory activists through common friends. This organization only takes in new members following a 6-month trial period, and the candidate has to be familiar to someone with the organization or to a reliable outside contact.
An organization with noble intentions that takes care of its image. I wanted to delve deeper into its work and came across one of the most sensational updates from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Russian warplanes kill 30 civilians in Homs, published on October the 1st. The targets mentioned are Talbisa, Rastan, and Al-Zafrana. Meanwhile, on the Arabic version of the website, the same date, the same locations, but no mention whatsoever of Russian airstrikes. We only see the words Assad regime. The contradicting reports can still be found on the webpage. Rami Abdulrahman's organization has been used as a primary source of information when it comes to Syrian civil war atrocities for years. We'd been wondering what makes their activists' reports so credible and widely trusted. Well, after talking to the director, I get it. It's because he trusts them.
We're following breaking news in the air war against ISIS. NATO member Turkey says it shot down a Russian warplane flying from Syria that violated Turkish airspace. Video shows the fighter jet on fire before it crashed into mountains. Smoke rises over the ridge.
Revenge can be an ugly thing, especially if waged in the unfriendly skies of Syria. For with the Russian-Syrian drive to drain the swamp in northern Syria and loyalist forces prevailing over Latakia, Turkish revenge will seep to the surface.
The Syrian army and the National Defense Forces NDF and Hezbollah seized back the areas of Al-Makashile and Jab al-Ammar in the northern parts of Latakia province on Saturday. The Syrian forces pushed back the militant groups and restored full security to Al-Ramaliyah and Al-Qidra hills.
Looks like Turkey's ambush of Russia's plane was planned payback due to Russia's devastating strikes on Erdogan's Syrian Turkmen rebels and allied Chechen jihadists in North Latakia. It's Turkey-Chechen solidarity ever since the Chechen wars, with the terrorist Chechen government in exile vowing to fight for Erdogan, the leader of the Muslim people, against Russia. And saying you're sorry is not what the Sultan is all about.
Was it a mistake? And will you apologize?
Well, I think if there's a party that needs to apologize, it's not us. Those who violated our airspace are the ones who need to apologize.
Liar. It's your F-16 that violated Syria's airspace when shooting down Russia's plane. And the U.S. and NATO know this. At minimum, they would have the heat signatures of the aircraft involved.
Putin has accused you of effectively stabbing him in the back, I think is the line he used, and as being Turkey as being an accomplice of terror. This is pretty fiery stuff, isn't it?
If Mr. Putin is saying that we are cooperating with Daesh, that we are accomplices, I think that would be a huge mistake. And Russia is not engaged in a fight against Daesh in Syria. On the contrary, they are actually targeting moderate opposition.
It's those moderates who celebrated their war crime when machine gunning the Russian pilot as he parachuted from the ambush plane. How is it that these Turkmen brigades, their leader, a Turkish Grey Wolf terrorist, knew the exact time of the shootdown? How is it that their cameras, video venues, and script were ready to go? Looks like coordinated and premeditated revenge.
Bugün Kızıldağ'a başlattığımız operasyona Rus destekli yineden havadan saldırı oldu. Rus uçağı Türkiye sınırını geçince Türk uçakları tarafından anında vurularak düşürüldü. Suriye tarafına düşen uçağın paraşütünün bir parçası. Diğer parçaları iç tarafta.
Atladıklarında ölü müydü?
Tabii bizim arkadaşlarımızla havaya ateş açtılar. Açtık hepimiz. Havada öldüler hepsi.
And when Putin called Turkey an accomplice of terrorists, he knew the place and the players.
В этой связи хочу сказать, что мы слышим сейчас о неких племенах, близких для Турции, туркоманов и так далее. Но, во-первых, возникает вопрос, что на этой территории делают представители террористических турецких организаций, которые сами попадают в объектив фотокамеры, а потом выкладывают сами себя в сеть. Второе, что на этой территории делают выходцы из Российской Федерации, которые находятся у нас в розыске за совершенные преступления, которые точно относятся к категории международных террористов.
Erdogan lets them through. He's been harboring these Chechen criminals for years. And he's not happy seeing his stolen Syrian oil empire going up in smoke.
Теперь, что касается нефти, да, вы спросили? И о том, что она якобы на территории Турции уничтожается. Я вот на двадцатке, кстати, в Турции, в Анталии, показывал фотографии, я уже говорил об этом публично, сделанные с высоты 5000 километров нашими летчиками. Автомобили, перевозящие нефть, выстроены в цепочку и уходят за горизонт. Это выглядит как живая нефтяная труба. Речь идет о промышленных масштабах поставок нефти с захваченных сирийских территорий, захваченных террористами. Именно с этих территорий, а не с каких других. И мы видим с воздуха, куда идут эти машины. Они днем и ночью идут в Турцию. Если там турецкие власти перерабатывают нефть, уничтожают ее, мы что-то не видим дыма от костров по уничтожению этой нефти.
But we're seeing lots of smoke from Russian jets blowing up ISIS oil trucks near Raqqa. For if you jettison the income ISIS makes from stolen oil, you take the jihadists down. That's exactly what Putin's doing. Russia's in charge, even if Jewish neocons try to get their boots on the ground.
We had Colonel Jack Jacobs on yesterday, and he said the only way to solve this problem is to put boots on the ground.
Yes.
There's no other way to stabilize the situation.
Yeah, so I am a big fan of Colonel Jacobs. But there are several military leaders, who believe, as Colonel Jacobs does, that if you actually want to rebuild and sort of recreate Syrian society, it will require a troop commitment on the scale that Colonel Jacobs is recommending.
He's going to recreate Syrian society with his fellow Jewish neocons? Just like they did in Iraq and Libya? Not this time. The Syrians will decide their own fate, not Jewish neocons. The cat's out of the bag. Turkey's been enabling ISIS terror. But their revenge against Russia backfired. Russia's now determined, more than ever, to finish the job. Putin just bombed Erdogan's latest weapons shipment into northern Syria, close to the border. It's a whole new ballgame, and Putin's hitting the home runs.
Теперь по поводу ПРО. Послушайте, вот здесь все очень взрослые люди и уже опытные. Мы с вами, я сейчас не буду просить, чтобы вы это все, вот так, как я скажу, отражали в своих материалах, влияли на прессу там, или как. Я просто вам, вот знаете, хочу вам лично сказать, напомнить какие-то вещи. Ведь мир избавлен от крупномасштабных войн и военных конфликтов. Мы с вами все об этом знаем. Благодаря так называемому стратегическому балансу, который был достигнут после того, как две суперядерные державы договорились фактически о сдерживании и в росте наступательных вооружений, и о сдерживании в системах противоракетной обороны. Потому что для всех понятно, если одна сторона развивает противоракетную оборону успешнее, чем вторая, то она приобретает преимущество, и у нее появляется искушение использовать это оружие первой. Поэтому это один из краеугольных камней международной безопасности, система противоракетной обороны и договоренности в этой сфере. Я далек от того, чтобы кого-то ругать, обвинять в чем-то. Но когда наши партнеры американские вышли в одностороннем порядке, они нанесли колоссальный удар, или вот это был первый удар по международной стабильности с точки зрения возможности нарушения баланса сил стратегического. Тогда я сказал, ну, мы сейчас не можем развивать эти технологии, поскольку, дорого, во-вторых, еще неизвестно, как они будут работать. Мы не будем просто деньги палить. Мы пойдем по другому пути, мы будем совершенствовать ударные системы, чтобы сохранить баланс. Только для этого. Не для того, чтобы угрожать кому-то. Нам ответили, ну да, это вот наша система ПРО не против вас, а то, что вы делаете, мы исходим из того, что это не против нас. Ну и делайте, что хотите. Я думаю, что вот такой постановка вопроса, она связана с тем, я уже говорил, по-моему, сегодня на пленарном заседании, связана была с тем, что это же начало 2000-х годов, Россия находилась в очень сложном положении. Развал экономики, значит, фактически гражданская война и борьба с терроризмом на Кавказе, оборонная промышленность в развале, вооруженные силы в ужасном состоянии. Ну, кому в голову приходилось, что Россия сможет наращивать стратегические вооружения? Наверное, думали о том, что пройдет некоторое время, имеющиеся, доставшиеся от Советского Союза вооружения будут деградировать. Поэтому надо сказать, да делайте, что хотите. Но мы предупреждали, что мы будем это делать. Мы сказали об этом. И мы делаем. И я вас уверяю, сегодня Россия добилась существенных успехов на этом пути. Я сейчас не буду всего перечислять, но мы модернизировали наши комплексы. И успешно развиваем новые поколения. Я уже не говорю о системах преодоления, системы противоракетной обороны. Но наши партнеры, несмотря на все наши возражения, на все наши предложения о реальном сотрудничестве, не хотят с нами сотрудничать, отвергают все наши предложения и действуют по своему плану. Я сейчас не буду, некоторые вещи считаю даже пока некорректным говорить публично. Но можете мне верить, можете не верить. Мы предлагали конкретные элементы, конкретный вариант сотрудничества. Они реально все были отклонены. Но вот все-таки пришли к тому, что сейчас построили систему ПРО в Румынии. Говорили это все время о чем? Нам нужно защититься от иранской ядерной угрозы. Где ядерная угроза иранская? Ее нет? Договор подписали уже. И причем Соединенные Штаты были, по сути, инициаторами этого договора с Ираном. Мы помогли, мы поддержали. Но если бы не позиция США, не было бы этого договора. И это, безусловно, заслуга президента Обамы. Потому что я считаю, это договор правильный, он разрядил ситуацию вокруг Ирана. И президент Обама может записать это, безусловно, в свой послужной список как результат своей работы на этом направлении. Но угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне, ссылаясь на якобы имеющуюся иранскую ядерную угрозу при строительстве системы ПРО. Ну так оно и есть на самом деле. В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему, сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется для пусков ракет средней дальности «Томагавк» морского базирования. Значит, туда закладывают сейчас антиракеты, способные поражать цели на расстоянии 500 километров. Но мы знаем, технологии развиваются. Мы примерно знаем, в каком году примерно американцы получат новую ракету, которая будет уже не 500 километров, а 1000, а потом больше. И с этого момента они начнут угрожать нашему ядерному потенциалу. Мы по годам знаем, что будет происходить. И они знают, что мы знаем. Это вам только вешают лапшу на уши, как у нас говорят. А вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться. И о чем говорят? Это часть оборонного потенциала, не наступательного. Это значит, системы, которые призваны оградить от агрессии. Это неправда, это не так. Стратегическая система противоракетной обороны – это часть наступательного стратегического потенциала. И все это работает в единой связке с наступательными ударными комплексами. Одни прикрывают, одни наносят упреждающий удар высокоточным оружием, другие прикрывают от ядерного ответного удара, третьи, значит, наносят сами ядерный удар. Это все в комплексе решается. В комплексе современном неядерного исполнения высокоточным оружием. Значит, ну ладно, вот эти противоракеты, которые будут развиваться и будут все больше и больше нам угрожать. Но вот в эти чехлы, куда закладываются антиракеты, я же сказал, что они берутся с кораблей, и там эти шахты, так скажем, используются для томагавков. Ну там можно вообще просто за несколько часов поставить туда томагавки и все. И это уже никакие не противоракеты. Откуда мы знаем, что там в этих шахтах находится? Нужно просто изменить программу. Все. Это работа абсолютно незаметная. До Румынии никто не будет знать, что там происходит. Их что, допускают румын туда, что ли? Никто не будет знать. Ни румыны не будут знать, ни поляки не будут знать. Я знаю, как это делается. Но это, на мой взгляд, это большая опасность. Вот когда-то мы обсуждали с нашими партнерами американскими, у них была идея создания баллистических ракет в неядерном исполнении. И мы им тогда сказали: слушайте, ну вы понимаете, что это такое или нет? Вот у вас будут стартовать ракеты с подводных лодок, с территории. Стартует баллистическая ракета. Мы же не знаем, есть там ядерная головка или нет. На какую угрозу вы будете создавать? Но, насколько нам известно, сегодня эта программа не осуществляется. Они ее остановили пока. Но это продолжают. К чему это все придет, я не знаю. Но я знаю точно, что мы вынуждены будем отвечать. Только я уже заранее знаю, чтобы нас будут обвинять в агрессивном поведении, хотя это только ответ. Но ясно, что мы должны будем обеспечить безопасность. Не только свою. Нам очень важно обеспечить стратегический баланс в мире. И еще раз вернусь к этому и закончу ответ на этот вопрос с того, с чего начал. Вот именно этот стратегический баланс гарантировал мир на планете, гарантировал нас от крупных вооруженных конфликтов за последние 70 лет. И это благо, хоть оно такое, знаете, основанное как бы на взаимной угрозе, но тем не менее взаимная угроза, она обеспечила нам глобальный мир на протяжении десятилетий. Как его можно разрушить, так я не знаю. Мне кажется, что это очень опасно. Не только кажется, я в этом уверен. Да, Соединенные Штаты не разрабатывают якобы наступательного оружия. Во всяком случае, общественности об этом неизвестно. Хотя наверняка разрабатывают. Но мы даже сейчас спрашивать об этом не будем. Мы знаем, что разработки идут. Но мы сейчас сделаем вид, что мы об этом не знаем. Не разрабатывают. Но что мы знаем? Это то, что в Соединенных Штатах активно разрабатывается и уже внедряется система противоракетной обороны. Да, сегодня она неэффективна, и мы точно не знаем, будет ли она вообще когда-нибудь эффективна. Но теоретически она ведь для этого и создается. Значит, опять же, гипотетически мы исходим из того, что когда-то наступит момент, когда возможная угроза со стороны наших ядерных сил будет полностью нейтрализована. Сегодняшних ядерных сил России. А если это так, то это означает, что баланс будет абсолютно нарушен. И что у одной из сторон возникнет ощущение полной безопасности. А значит, это развязывает ей руки не только в локальных, а возможно уже и в глобальных конфликтах. Мы же с вами сейчас дискутируем. Я не хочу никого подозревать в какой-то агрессивности. Но система отношений, это так же, как математика. Она не имеет личного измерения. И мы должны, конечно, на это реагировать. Как? Или так же, как вы, и строить многомиллиардную противоракетную систему, систему противоракетной обороны, либо, имея в виду наши возможности сегодняшние, экономические, финансовые, ответить асимметрично, чтобы все поняли, что да, система противоракетной обороны есть, но она в отношении России бессмысленна, потому что у нас есть такое оружие, которое легко преодолевает. Вот мы по этому пути и пойдем. Это дешевле для нас. Но это никак не направлено против самих Соединенных Штатов. Я полностью согласен с... если вы говорите, что система ПРО не направлена против нас, то и наше новое оружие не направлено против вас.
The NATO summit has got underway in Warsaw, aiming to show resolve amid a perceived threat from Russia. It's expected to agree formally to send 4 battalions with 3,000 to 4,000 troops to the Baltic states and eastern Poland. Britain is sending 650. The aim to reassure countries that NATO is ready to defend them while trying to avoid antagonizing Moscow.
Stability of the Euro-Atlantic region depends on security beyond our borders. While we should stand by our defense commitment, we must enhance cooperation with all partners, both in the eastern and southern neighborhood. We are not surrounded by enemies. We are surrounded by challenges.
Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but President Poroshenko has been invited and will meet allied leaders on Saturday. President Obama has called for sanctions on Moscow to be maintained until it fully complies with a ceasefire agreement in Ukraine and to help Kiev defend its sovereignty. The Baltic states and Poland fear Russia will seek to destabilize their governments. The Kremlin argues that talk of a threat from Russia is absurd and says it hopes common sense will prevail.
блок НАТО выдвигает свои войска к России на аванпост.
Плакаты эти на каждом углу в Варшаве. Тема защиты от российской угрозы в повестке саммита доминирует.
Зачем им эти новые батальоны, ракетные позиции, аэродромы и склады? В субботу в Варшаве завершился воистину исторический саммит НАТО, на котором военный блок принял решение о качественном изменении своего отношения к России. Россия уже не партнер, а цель. Понятно, что на словах это звучит как укрепление обороны на восточном направлении, но агрессивное продвижение к нашим границам новых баз, аэродромов, ракетных позиций, складов, новых командных пунктов и центров связи не оставляет сомнений, что Североатлантический договор готовится к войне. Блок НАТО, который в своей истории еще никого не защитил, но покрыл себя позором в ходе агрессивных военных операций в Югославии и Ливии, теперь наращивает свою инфраструктуру и военные возможности непосредственно у наших рубежей в Прибалтике и Польше. Туда же перебросят и новые войска. Речь пока о батальонах, но задача этих батальонов – создать условия для возможности быстрого наращивания контингента НАТО у наших границ. Понятно, что России придется реагировать, но ничего чрезмерного. Возможности для этого есть. Многих заставила удивиться наша воздушная операция в Сирии. Но есть у нас и то, что показывать мы не спешим и даже упоминаем осторожно. Как, например, на совещании по военно-техническому сотрудничеству, фрагмент которого показали в пятницу.
Россия инвестирует в разработку передовых оборонных технологий, расширяет спектр поставляемой продукции. Это от стрелкового оружия до новейших средств ведения воздушного и морского боя, которые способны изменить соотношение на любом театре военных действий.
Новым было приглашение на саммит НАТО президента Украины. Украина для НАТО – антироссийский таран. Порошенко свою страну полностью сдал, развалил, сделал самой бедной в Европе и все еще толкает на войну. Опросы показывают, что украинцы даже без учета территории Донбасса в НАТО не хотят. Для Порошенко это лишь повод для его бессмысленной улыбки на ритуальных натовских фотосессиях. Пока он ищет место, позу и наклон головы, Донбасс находится под ежедневным обстрелом. По данным ООН, опубликованным в субботу, число жертв среди мирных жителей в июне оказалось рекордным с августа прошлого года. 12 погибших, ранено 57. Обстрелы идут из минометов, артиллерийских систем и даже из установок залпового огня, что точно запрещено Минскими соглашениями. Понятно, что ответный огонь идет и со стороны Донбасса, но все в целом для Порошенко отмазка не менять Конституцию, не принимать законы о местных выборах, вообще ничего не делать для прекращения братоубийственной войны. НАТО все это лицемерно устраивает. О том, как все было обставлено в Варшаве, Ольга Скобеева.
На этих кадрах хорошо видно, украинский охранник демонстративно закрывает своей спиной нашу камеру, делая все, чтобы президент Порошенко не попал в объектив. Все это время украинские журналисты, оказалось, снимали, как нам не дают снимать. Видео потом появится в интернете. Гарно працує, охранников будут очень хвалить.
Канцлер Німеччини Ангела Меркель, президент Франції Франсуа Оланд и президент Сполучених Штатів Америки Барак Обама.
Почти пустой и очень маленький зал. Брифинг, что называется, для своих. Порошенко перечисляет, с кем на саммите ему удалось повидаться, и начинает спускаться со сцены.
Петр Алексеевич, когда могут пройти выборы на Донбассе? Как вы думаете?
Как только будут созданы условия безопасности, как только русские перестанут убивать украинцев, как только будут выведены российские войска оккупационные с территории Украины.
Договорив, хорошо видно, Порошенко резко отталкивает наш микрофон. Это главный аргумент официального Киева. Украину нужно срочно защищать от агрессора. То есть нужно, если не взяли в ЕС, хотя бы взять в НАТО.
Thank you very much for all your work during the summit. Thank you.
Но несмотря на объятия, Столтенберг предельно ясно подведет итог саммита, куда Украину пригласили не как полноправного члена, а только как гостя.
Вопрос о членстве в настоящее время не стоит на повестке. Нужно сфокусироваться на том, как Украине соответствовать стандартам НАТО.
Минимум 10 лет. Это тоже цитата генсека. В НАТО не берут страны с территориальными конфликтами. И это главное правило НАТО. На агитацию за Украину были брошены лучшие силы. Депутат Рады Савченко на публике появляется в белой полупрозрачной кофте. Объявлявшая много раз голодовку Надежда в Польше ест и пьет с каким-то особенным аппетитом.
Надежда, скажите, пожалуйста, какая у вас функция здесь на саміті НАТО в Варшаві?
У мене залишилося 5 хвилин до виїзду, я дуже вибачаюся. Ви мене просто не можете зрозуміти. Мені жаль, що ви не говорите українською, вчіть українську.
Савченко мчится на интервью. На саммит она приехала не босиком, с очень большой дамской сумкой, которую не выпускала из рук. И, как всегда, без макияжа. Депутат, как известно, уже выражала готовность стать и украинским министром обороны, и президентом. С Донбассом она считает нужным начать диалог.
Ви не знаєте української мови. Я з вами говорю, я вас розумію, ви мене не розумієте. Навчіться, будь ласка, розуміти мене, і ми поговоримо. Коли ви заговорите українською мовою, ми з вами поговоримо. Дуже вам дякую.
Ваша позиция отличается по Донбассу от позиции официальной Украины. Вы как-то смогли повлиять на Порошенко в этом смысле, Надежда? Говорите по-украински, если вам удобно.
Мені дуже шкода, тепер я вас не розумію. Я не розумію російської.
Вы же прекрасно говорите по-русски.
Я вас не зрозуміла. Я вас не зрозуміла, мені прикро. Мені шкода, я вас не розумію.
Образ народного депутата сформирован, кажется, окончательно. Небрежная, резкая, с легкостью переходит на брань, но готова помочь. Все это время оператор, снимая, идет спиной и все-таки спотыкается.
Муха! Да що ж ви ненормальні люди такі? Що ж ви творите? Все добре?
Да, спасибо.
Слава Богу. Ви іноді своєю роботою б'єте себе. Не йдіть, будь ласка, задом, ви зараз ще раз перечепитесь. Ви можете це зрозуміти?
Рассказав о российской агрессии, саммит Савченко покидает. Россия как экспортер нестабильности. Журнал с фотографией Путина на главной странице раздавали при входе на стадион плакатами. С предупреждением о российской угрозе сейчас обклеена вся Варшава. Министр обороны Польши, тот самый господин Мочеревич, что отличился беспрецедентным антироссийским демаршем. В преддверии саммита Мочеревич сказал, что Россию нужно немедленно останавливать силой.
Еще раз.
Россию главной угрозой для всего мира. Почему?
Так долго.
Пока Россия будет оккупировать независимое государство Украины, пока она будет вести войну против независимого государства Украины, мы будем считать ее главной угрозой. Так звучит это предложение. Пожалуйста, передайте его целиком. А сказал я это, потому что Россия единственное государство в Европе, которое своими милитаристскими действиями подрывает европейский порядок. Российские войска убивают людей на Украине. Это нельзя продолжать дальше. Такого быть не должно.
Вчера мы слышали агрессивные высказывания в отношении России, которая планирует атаковать Польшу.
Из Москвы.
Как раз отсюда.
Вы никогда не услышите от Польши агрессии. Любая агрессия сейчас и исходит только из Москвы, в сторону Европы и остального мира. НАТО – это оборонный альянс. Мы не планируем никакой агрессии, никакой конфронтации ни с кем. Мы просто планируем защитить самих себя.